Hello. Welcome to my channel Touching Stories. You're about to hear an amazing story about love and unexpected decisions. Enjoy watching.
It seemed to Leo that the whole world was an ocean and people were like sea creatures. The most beautiful and brightest fish are in view. Politicians, stars, and celebrities. Crabs swarm on the seashore. What not builders, what not traders. The water surface is cut now and then by the fins of sharks, which remind Leo of businessmen. And where is his place in this ocean of life? At the bottom. That's where the most unpleasant creatures like him hide. Their faces wrinkled, their bodies unnatural. But once upon a time, long ago, Leo was a shark, a goldfish. At the very least, he could have been a crab, cowering on the shore. But fate dealt him a different card, and Leo became a drifter. These guys come in many forms. There are those who collect aluminum cans from morning till night, doing the cheapest jobs. Others find a beggarly profession. They become street artists, luggage porters at train stations, cleaners in supermarkets. The most successful can even grab a bed in a room, but even with it you remain a beggar. Only now you worry not only about food and drink, but also about rent. And once you're behind on your rent, you're welcome to the streets. Leo was a vagrant of the lowest caste, from the very bottom. He begged in the crosswalks and at the train station, begging for change, which was barely enough for the cheapest food and drink. His comrades in misfortune called him Prince. Why? Only theorists talk about the bottom of life and rising from it. They look for reasons why people lose everything, even their own names and surnames, suggesting paths that resemble higher mathematics in their level of complexity. But Leo was a practitioner. He knew there was no bottom. You can always go a little lower. After the luxurious mansion of his parents, the brothels where all the vices of society thrive. After successful studies at an expensive university, it was to beg for change from passersby. He didn't go down that road quickly. No, contrary to all the arguments of theorists, in practice falling into the abyss resembles climbing a mountain. Not everyone reaches the top. Not everyone falls to the bottom. There were many stairs between the mansion with the heated pool and the basement lodge. Friends' apartments, bunk beds in hostels, bunks in social sleepovers. Between the promising life of a future financier and a coin mug, deceptions, betrayal, and judgment. But it's all in the past. If you look at your past life from the bottom, it's covered by a column of murky water. Leo no longer looked to the past or the future. The planning horizon had shrunk to one day today. Not so bad, if you thought about it. He consoled himself with the thought that it could have been worse. Became a junkie like Pete, or froze his foot off like Joe. As it was, he was just an alcoholic, could walk on his own and even climb into deep basements. That's because he played sports in college. So the planning horizon and today, not such a bad day really. Today, Leo managed to scrounge up $4.92. Not enough for a bed in the lodge. We'll have to sleep in the basement. But a loaf of bread, a bottle of port, and a candy bar would do. Leo was too relaxed to move towards the beggar's store. He was already anticipating how he would open the port wine, how he would take the first sip. He counted in his mind that instead of a chocolate bar, he could buy the cheapest hot sausage or hamburger. How, after getting drunk, he would cozy up on the cardboard and dream about his past life. And then, all of a sudden, out of the blue, "Hey, Prince," a familiar voice called out to him. "Come here." "Well, I'm waiting." "Oh no." He was too relaxed today and forgot about Theo. He's always avoiding this place. This territory where he's been zeroed in on so many times. Yeah, beggars have their own boundaries and domains. This place was ruled by a former boxer and street hooligan whose real name nobody knew. Everyone called him by his nickname in the ring, the Toreador or Theo. He's able to shake money from all the underprivileged and also from children, but not the ones who'd run to their parents to complain. Boxer somehow knows how to tell them apart. He's afraid of normal people, but not of lowlights like Leo. "What did you scrape up, huh?" Theo asked lazily. Leo had tried to challenge him for leadership once before and had gotten a very painful blow in the ear. He hadn't heard from him for a month. Now he tried to be polite to his tormentor. "Theo, please. I feel so bad." Leo asked. "I need a bottle badly. I'm dying." "Who's having a good time?" The ex-boxer asked. "You think I like it here, vetting guys like you? I'd like to be in the ring." "Footlights, a model with the round number. You ain't never been in a gym like this, have you?" "Where I boxed." "Well, "What have you got? Show me." Leo remembered betting $1,000 on some boxer. What was his name? Tyler or Bronson? And he lost that time in a past life. And he wasn't even a little bit upset because his father had money in the bank. And now he's shaking on a low five. Theo took everything but $1. "Here, Prince," said the boxer with a smile, a few of his front teeth missing. "Go on and don't deny yourself anything." Leo sighed and wandered back. "We'd have to stand in the crosswalk some more, but it's good in the mornings, and then in the evening rush hour when everyone comes home from work. 9 o'clock is dead time. For some innocent question about a couple of coins, you can get a punch in the forehead." Leo fixed his beard, smoothed his greasy hair. And then he saw her. No, it couldn't have been him. Just in case, the beggar left his passage and went to the next one. Leo felt his pulse quicken and his heart began to pound hard. She. No, it couldn't be. Nick was working in the next crosswalk. He probably already left, so he wouldn't mind. And there's a coffee machine. What do we got here? Check the change compartment, 10 cents. That's not bad. Nick was really nowhere to be found, so by the unwritten rules of beggars, he might as well take his place temporarily. To get a couple of dollars quickly, Leo decided to use a forbidden trick. He stood near the coffee machine and waited for someone to order a drink. "Good evening," he said to the man who had just thrown a $10 bill into the machine and pressed the lotto button. "I'm embarrassed to be addressing you, but go to hell," the stranger replied, shoveling change out of the change tray. What? Leo made a puzzled grimace, but the man didn't seem to be in a lyrical mood. "You must have misunderstood me." "Go, I said," he said. "You stink like the devil himself. Why did you come to me in the first place? I thought I was going to talk to a human being, and here." Then there was a little blackout. The stranger must have had enough and hit Leo. And it must have hit him in the solar plexus, because it was like the lights went out. The next moment, when the tramp came to his senses, he had a bill in his hand. $10. Leo, from surprise, almost fainted again. A whole $10. Enough for the night's lodging and the port. He wasn't hungry anymore. He nimbly tucked the bill into his sock and walked down neutral streets, where no one would claim his earnings. He walked up to his favorite little bed and breakfast with a shower, the best combination of price and quality, and the Castellan was clearly breathing heavily in his direction. But she'd probably send him to the showers now, since he hadn't been here in a month, if not 2. When was the last time he stood under the jets of water? Now he'll wash up, trim his beard with a pair of scissors, trim his hairline a little, and run to the store. A convenience store, the kind where no one looks at your appearance. They'll have time to get drunk before 11 o'clock. "Oh look, the lion cub's here," smiled the Castellan, revealing her missing teeth. "Are you saving money, little one? Have you forgotten all about your mommy?" Leo smiled and ignored her barb. It was better not to quarrel with that woman. After all, she was the only one who decided who would sleep in the bunk tonight and who would sleep outside. He slipped the Castellan a $10 bill, got $5 in change, and went to the 10th room. All the seats on the first tier were already taken. It was no trouble. He could go up to the second tier. Putting down the bag with his belongings, Leo rushed into the common bathroom. Free. Unlike dozens and hundreds of his fellows, he couldn't get used to the lack of hygiene. Every night, he could feel with his skin the urge to take a shower, and he suffered the most from it. Lathering his body with free soap, Leo literally got high. Then looking in the mirror, he tried to cut the unruly hairs from his face and head. It was even worse than it had been. But it's okay, they'll grow back in a couple days. After the shower, the dirty clothes didn't want to fit on my body, they stuck. The laundry room was already closed because the dryer drum was making too much noise. You have to come early to use it. You always feel better after a bath. Even a wimp like Leo felt better. He looked at himself in the mirror. He looked almost young. How old is he? Leo tried to count in his mind. I think it was 33 or 34. And here he was already at the bottom. Leo remembered the starting point where it all began and sighed bitterly. The Castellan, who was clearly sympathetic to him, had given him a traditional sandwich and a disposable toothbrush. It seemed to be her duty, but not all visitors got the bonus. And let's face it, most of them didn't even know how to brush. Leo ate a sandwich with a thin layer of margarine and ham and brushed his teeth, noting the pain in several of them. I'll have to pull them out, he thought, or suffer through it. There was a note in the bag. He knew at once that the Castellan had written it. She wanted to meet him. There was no point in upsetting his aunt, but he wasn't going to reciprocate. Who did she think she was, after all? So he put the note in his pocket without unfolding it. He returned to the common room, climbed to the second tier, realized that he had forgotten to run for port wine. He closed his eyes and fell asleep, and in the lingering, restless slumber I saw her. The very day after which everything went wrong. The very minute after which he had descended or climbed to the bottom, and cried in his sleep and screamed, and the rest of the temporary roommates flinched and looked at the noisy guests with displeasure. In the morning, Leo woke up and remembered the note that had been in the sandwich bag. Where had it gone? The idea of making the Castellan happy didn't seem quite so crazy anymore. The note was found, but with difficulty. When Leo unfolded it and read it, his hair stood on end. Was it really her? Candy was over the moon. Love, true love. It was exactly what she used to read about in books and watch in movies growing up in her parents' home. There, in her native village, there was all nature, forest, river, horses. But she, like her sister, was always drawn to the city. It seemed to her that here she will quickly find happiness, and people will be friendly and kind to her. Alas, the city is 50% made up of knave fools like her. Just when Kendi was about to despair, he and his love appeared. To think that something like that could happen in real life. That's why she was over the moon, and still 2 months pregnant. It's just a pity that Leonard was in no hurry to bring clarity to their relationship. His face was as impenetrable as his father's. Candy thought he took the news of the pregnancy coolly. He even asked her to show him the test. But that didn't mean anything. Obviously, everyone takes the news of impending parenthood differently. But yesterday, I think it all became clear. Leonard took her to the lakeside, the most romantic place this side of the ocean. "It'll be our secret, baby girl," he said, smiling for the first time in a long time. "Leave your girlfriend a note saying you're leaving. I'll be waiting for you at our secret spot. And be sure to bring your suitcase." The place, however, was known to all the couples who preferred to seclude themselves in cars in this part of town. By a strange coincidence, her room was nearby. Candy couldn't afford a spacious apartment, but she didn't want to live on campus either. They'd be married soon, and they'd be sure to get a bigger place. She never told him anything about her sister. He thinks she's living with her girlfriend. "Where are you going?" Cindy asked. "A secret," smiled Candy. Even though her sister is 2 years younger, Kendi and Cindy looked like twins. They were often confused at school, though if you look closely, there were clearly more differences than similarities. Cindy is a little taller, and Kendi is a little shorter, a couple of centimeters. The younger sister loved dramas and the older sister loved detectives. Kendi went to law school and Cindy went to design school. But the sisters loved each other and never fought. In a big, ruthless city, they could only count on themselves and each other. "Where are you going, you little thing?" Cindy wouldn't stop. "Shut up, you little bub," laughed Candy. They often made up hurtful nicknames for each other. He said it should be our secret. "Uh-huh," replied the younger one. Did the big boy have a conscience? Decided to take him somewhere beyond the parking lot for once. "You don't understand anything. I told you," Candy said sharply. "He's gonna propose." "He will." "God willing," Cindy replied. She was worried about her sister. After talking to the younger one, Candy was beginning to feel afraid too. She had convinced her so much that Leonard didn't really love her that she had doubts. Luckily, he would show up and all fears would immediately fade away. They drove to their secret place and there, Sydney did not yet know that her sister was in an interesting position. Leonard had forbidden her to tell anyone. He's very superstitious. "You'll be dancing at my wedding," whispered Candy. "You'll see." "Oh, sister," answered Cindy. They had nowhere to hide from each other in the small room. The only thing that helped was the common terrace, where they could go out and get some air. The enterprising owners divided the rooms with partitions and rented their small house to 10 guests at once. At first, it was not easy for the girl to share the territory with so many people. There were only 2 bathrooms and 1 kitchen for such a crowd. Squabbling, crowding, constant noise, all the charms of life in a huge city, but it's cheap. Leonard showed her another world, another universe. Everything was different on the planet of luxury and wealth. Huge houses with swimming pools and saunas, fancy cars, expensive suits and ties. They met by chance. In order to simplify the life of her father and mother, Candy got a job in a bar for the rich to sell flowers to drunken guests at night. The first time they met, Leonard bought a whole basket of them. "I would like to take to these luxurious flowers their charming salesman," he smiled. The young man, whom the sister scornfully called a major, drove her out of town in his luxurious Cadillac. He spoke beautiful words, praised her perfect figure, and then she was a little ashamed. But Leonard said it was normal, and some people were literally made for each other. Since then, he'd come to see her a couple times a week, taking her to that secret spot. Then he'd drive her back, and at her request, drop her off about 200 meters from her house. She thought it was a relationship. "You're a fool," the younger one said, but Kendi wouldn't listen to her. In the morning, when her sister was still asleep, the girl took her suitcase and carefully walked out the door. The whole big house was resting, so there was an unaccustomed silence in the rooms. No one was to see her leave this place forever. Kendi had been lucky. No one else from her town, which for some reason was called the village, and ever won a law school grant. In class, the children of rich and successful parents, of course, teased her about her accent, her cheap clothes. But Leonard balanced it all out, and when she found out she was going to have a baby, she was scared at first. First of all, college. But you can take a sabbatical for at least a year. She's in good standing, she's bound to get favorable treatment. Secondly, finances. But Leonard's parents have a lot of money, they should be able to make it work. Thirdly, she was just scared. Although it was only the 10th week of pregnancy, her body had already begun to metamorphose. What would happen next? "Good morning, baby." He smiled and opened the trunk with a button. Loaded in there. Little things like that, of course, annoyed Candy. She had to put the suitcase in the trunk herself. Good thing it was light. Leo never opened the door for her, rarely hugged her in public, hardly ever gave her gifts. Once he brought her to his parents' house, a luxurious mansion. But he wouldn't even introduce her to mom or dad. On the contrary, he walked her through the back door like a spy. But love gave her the strength to forgive. So what if they'd only known each other a few months? Yes, he's arrogant, impulsive, but he's still her man. The drive to Lakeside wasn't a short one, and Kendi dozed off, stretching out in the back seat. She adored both Leonard and his Cadillac. They were both so easy and comfortable. "Wake up, baby," her husband-to-be said. "We're here." Cold enough as it was, today he outdid himself. Looking around, Leonard strode forward. He didn't even look in her direction. It was obvious he was worried. Lakeside was very quiet in the mornings, and at this time, not a soul at all. Of course he's going to propose, Candy reassured herself. It's not an easy step to take. It's understandable. Leonard climbed higher and higher to the cliff. From there, he had a magnificent view of the vast lake. Whether it was the pregnancy or the early awakening, the girl found it difficult to walk. Her man didn't even look back, and the gap between them grew wider and wider. She was treading on the polished stones of the path, and her strength to move on was diminishing. "Would you help me?" she finally asked, and felt a pang of guilt. She couldn't handle anything on her own. "Oh, I'm sorry," he replied, and hurried back for Kendi. Leonard supported her, but in a detached way. Coldly. That's not how one holds a future wife, the girl thought. Is he really that worried? There was no one on the cliff at this early hour. The view was indeed breathtaking. A light haze was rising over the lake. Together, they walked to the very edge of the cliff. She looked thoughtfully into the distance and imagined herself as a bird flying over the water. He said. "I don't even know what to say." "Tell it like it is." Candy smiled without turning around. She looked ahead, admiring the scenery. Strong hands grabbed her shoulders and turned her around. The girl realized that he wanted to kiss her. In general, long conversations were not easy for him. But Leonard knew the language of love perfectly. Candy smiled, though her man's grip on her seemed too strong. "I want to memorize your eyes," he said. "What?" The girl wondered, and in the same second loving hands sharply pushed her away. She felt the ground go from under her feet, and from surprise, she couldn't even scream. Leo opened his eyes. Nightmares again. He saw her again. At times, the vagabond completely forgot the green eyes and could live in peace. In the daylight, he rarely felt remorse. But at night, he was much more concerned about his ringing head. To think he hadn't had a drop of liquor last night, it felt like he'd been drinking half the night. Leo wanted to lie down for another half an hour, They would kick him out of the lodging house at 8 in the morning, and it was only 7. But something was keeping him from lying down. Something burrowed into his rib like a parasite. The vagrant scratched the spot lazily, and his hand came across a piece of paper. Exactly the same note the Castellan had given him. Leo unfolded it, and the greasy hairs on his head stirred. "Miss me." The vagrant jumped down from the second tier and immediately began to gather up his unpretentious belongings. The fellow beggars grumbled unhappily. They hadn't paid $5 each to be woken up by a hobo this early. But Leo did not listen to the disgruntled voices. He was possessed by an animal fear that drove him away. After years of vagrancy, no emotion lingers in the soul for long, and so his fear subsided when he reached the crossing of his hometown. The townspeople were in a hurry to get to work, which meant it was time for him to get to work too. He pulled a cup of coffee from the trash can, opened the lid, and drank the rest with relish. Then he reached out and started collecting coins. It's the Castellan playing around, Leo thought. What a naughty old thing. Certainly she was always paying him favors, and once she'd even given him an extra sandwich. She was very lucky. The woman had found this sweet position years ago. And before that, they say, also wandered. She's paid well, $100 a week, but she has to work 12 or 14 hours a day. Cleaning up after guys like him is not much of a job. No, Leo couldn't do it. He hated boring jobs that took up all his free time. Stock trading was his thing. It was his thing. It's a man's sport. But if you get hurt in the stock market, you're out of the field for the rest of your life, or in the ring for that matter. "Good morning, miss," he said, nodding to his regulars. "Thank you for the coin." "Good day, sir. Thank you." Whenever there was a decent amount of money in the cup, it was supposed to be hidden. Leave a few coins so passersby could see he wasn't just standing there, he was working. Leo was so accustomed to sitting without a penny in his pocket that he didn't even immediately remember the $5 left over from last night. Slapping himself on the forehead, he put the change in his pocket, threw the cup in the trash, and went to the cafe. He's not allowed in decent places. He goes to the beggar's canteen only when absolutely necessary. Not only do they feed him bread and margarine, but they make him recite prayers and sing songs and repent. And Leo hates admitting his own mistakes. Even though he wasn't allowed in the McDonald's lounge, he could go on McDrive if there were no cars. Once upon a time he could pull it here in his own Cadillac. It was almost impossible to believe. Leo bought 2 hamburgers, fries, and a double Americano. It was almost $6, but it was worth it. Sitting down at the curb, on the curb, he enjoyed his meal. Eating, of course, was uncomfortable. He, as a visitor, had the right to sit at a table, to sit on a soft couch. Most likely he had, but he didn't use it. After all, the staff could have called the cops, or the next time they wouldn't sell him anything at all. Leo quickly swallowed the buns and cutlets, and now sipped his coffee with pleasure. He took a sip and put the glass on the pavement. It had been a long time since he'd had that drink. Makes him feel better than booze. Leo was looking ahead when he heard a nasty but familiar sound. Someone had kicked the glass. The rest of the coffee spilled onto the pavement. Theo was standing next to him, grinning. "Theo." Leonard was outraged. "Why?" "Why?" Theo looked surprised. "Because I can, Prince." "Get it? What are you doing here? You live for nothing?" Leo almost cried in helplessness. Just think about it. Some city lunatic takes his honestly earned money, pours out his coffee, and rubs his sides. The tramp didn't want to put up with it, but he couldn't do anything about it either. Complain to the police. They wouldn't let him out of the station. Fight back. "Why are you sitting there when I'm talking to you?" Theo planted his foot on his chest and gave him a painful squeeze. Leo's breath caught. "Sorry," he replied, rubbing the bruised area. "I'm exhausted." "So you're eating burgers without me?" Theo continued and gave him a hard slap. "I wish you'd offered. I haven't had a poppy seed since this morning." Leo jumped up from the blow, rubbing his cheek. They were standing near the roadway. Sure, you don't see cars around here that often. But by the unspoken rule of the beggars, this area was considered a no man's land, and anyone can come and sit in silence and solitude. Theo was breaking those rules and he knew it. "Listen, boxer," began Leo, trying to speak conciliatory. "I don't need any trouble. I'm going to leave now. I don't have any more money. I don't have any belongings either." "You?" Boxer grabbed him by the shoulders and set him down on the curb. He smirked. How much strength did he have left in him? When the tramp tried to get up, Theo prevented him from doing so. He'd slap his cheeks lightly, but hurtfully, and then he'd hit him on the head, then on the legs, throwing Leo to the dead grass, and openly mocked him. Such behavior was frowned upon among beggars. They were the dregs of society, not teenagers. None of the vagabonds found out relationships just for the love of the art of conflict. Leo tried to crawl back, but Theo, with half a toothless grin, chased after him, stepped on his foot. And then, "Can I help you?" He heard a woman's voice and turned around. The woman, one of those kind-hearted madams ready to separate vagrants, looked nothing like her. But for some reason it seemed otherwise to Leo. He jumped up and darted across the street, and just blew away Theo, who was trying to block his way. The former boxer flew a couple of meters to the center of the road and almost hit a rare car that passed here once an hour or less. Leo was running for his life, and somehow unknown to him he found himself back in his native passage. Here he felt at once calmer, as if he had returned to his own home. Even the townspeople looked at him with a little less contempt. Of course they did, because he was working here, not just hanging around. I think the lack of booze was starting to make him crazy. I should have bought a bottle of good old port instead of a double Americano. Besides, it's the same price. And now, because of his forced sobriety, Leo's head began to have bad thoughts. Yes, he did it 10 years ago or so. And now he's in agony, but you can't admit it to anyone. You have to deny it. Luke had spent more hours on the road than one could imagine. For some reason, no one in his neighborhood wanted to be a traffic cop, so he was always on duty, often without a partner. Other policemen without help is afraid even to go to the store, but Luke is not like that. But no one wants to mess with him. He's the biggest cop in the tourist part of town. And there's nothing going on here if you ask me. When Luke sees the dark red car, he turns on his blinkers. An expensive Cadillac with chrome hubcaps stopped. The driver's window rolled down. "Is there a problem, officer?" Leonard asked, smiling nonchalantly, though he was actually scared. "Just an ID check," the patrolman replied. He hated big guys in expensive cars. To look at him, he wasn't even 25 yet. He'd never worked a day in his life. And the car cost as much as his house or even more. Luke quickly assessed the car. Rare, probably custom built. Leonard put his hands on the steering wheel not only because the radio had taught him to do so. He couldn't stop his fingers from trembling. So that the officer wouldn't see it, he squeezed the leather steering wheel. It was soothing, but not very soothing. After he'd gotten away unnoticed, it would be foolish to get caught by some thug. "Insurance expired, sir," the cop said. "I'd better get a new one." "Thank you," Leo smiled. He didn't even want to explain that this car had a separate insurance policy, which was as thick as a book. "Can I go now?" "Have a safe trip." The cop heard the walkie-talkie and immediately ran to the car. Something had happened on the lakeside again. He heard the investigation team and the rescue squad being called. It wasn't his department. He never understood how those smart guys investigated crimes. He was only interested in the chases. Adrenaline, tires squealing, driving on the edge. That was the life he liked. But crime, no, not that, no. It's better to stand on the road, all alone, even without a partner. And then years later, a smart guy poked Luke with a picture of a hobo. Tangled hair, hunted look. Apparently, it was taken by a homeless outreach service called The Way Back. Who needs the scum of the earth? Luke, who was in his final months of service before retirement, struggled to remember. But the further he got, the more he thought the smart guy in the white shirt was just messing with him. "Do you recognize him?" "Well, ask the officer, one of the ones Luke called jackets. They don't even wear real uniforms." "You know, son, I'm sorry," the old cop said, making sure not to offend the smart guy. "He looks like a regular hobo. I'll put 5 of these in a row for you. You wouldn't know the difference." "Master Luke, think back." The officer wouldn't let it go. "Red Jaguar. Burgundy leather interior. Very rare around here. Didn't this guy look like the driver?" The old cop couldn't take it anymore and laughed. "No, just think about it. This misunderstanding behind the wheel of a Yaga? Who would let him into the cabin of such an expensive car? The burgundy leather, oh." In his thoughts, Luke stroked the noble surface. If a hobo like that got into a car like this, he'd spit him out like a fly. "Son," said the traffic cop, "I'll tell you like it is. Beggars don't drive cars, not unless they steal one. And if a lump like that stole a Jaguar with a maroon interior, I'd kill myself to chase him down. And you would have found my report, son, even years later. All right, the smart guy wouldn't give up. How about this one? The investigator took out another photograph. It had a completely different face on it. Happy, smarmy. Girls like that. A yellow tie tied on a white shirt. And the smile. There's $100 invested in that smile. Has he ever seen one of these? Do you recognize this one? The investigator asked. Give it to me, Luke asked. He held the card up to his eyes. Red Jaguar, leather steering wheel. I think it was the day the girl was pulled from the bottom of the lake. The kind of pretty redneck he'd seen a picture of on the news later. But is it him? Or did he just look like a rich kid, the son of rich parents? And was there a Jaguar? Absolutely not. I'll tell you this, Luke sighed. Typical Major. I've pulled them over a lot. Drunk, half dead. Maybe you got a picture of the car. The investigator crinkled his nose. Of course, there was no photo. After all, the traffic cops all look alike. Vagrants or rich guys. Cars are another matter, but he didn't have a picture of the Jaguar. The expensive car must have disappeared into a private collection, and the new owner did not respond to the numerous requests of the police in the local newspapers, or just didn't read them. Bless you, Luke replied, rising from his chair and heading for the exit. He was angry that the smartest had made him come all this way, just for the sake of showing a picture of a hobo and a major. Investigator Mark sighed. It seemed he never solved this murder. And was there really a murder? It's convenient to have a body and a knife. Or a body and a gun. Ideal when the perp tells someone about his exploits. Some guys kill someone, and soon the whole town knows who and when. What does he, Mark, have on this guy? Testimony from interested parties. Circumstantial evidence. The girl had at least a few reasons to kill herself. Several. But something kept Mark on his toes. Something that kept him going over and over again through the paperwork of the county's most notorious cold case. And it wasn't just that poor woman's restless sister, of course. No. Some inner feeling compelled him to leaf through the file again and again. A beggar's everyday life is like snowflakes or raindrops. The constant search for food and drink, running from the police, cheating social services. For some reason, everyone who does not live on the streets considers vagrants as violators and criminals. Not at all. There is much more grayness and humility among them than one might imagine at first glance. After so many years of wandering, Leo convinced himself that he liked the nomadic life. And in a normal world, he would simply wither away like a plant left without water. Come here, Prince. Theo almost shouted. Come here, come here. Leo involuntarily wrinkled his nose. This boxer had broken every possible rule of life on the street, coming to deal with him in his own crosswalk. It was tantamount to a declaration of war. And what would he fight for? His street will be fatter. You can gut schoolboys, shake coins out of alcoholics. What about here? Standing around with a mug, baiting for change from the townspeople? Okay, Theo, back off, Leo demanded. This is my turf. See, I'm working. You're gonna scare away all my customers. Your territory. Theo was indignant. You work here. You threw me in front of a car, asshole. You made me scratch my side. I apologize, said the tramp. I didn't mean to, really. Sorry. Theo's eyes went wide with anger. Here, a powerful left hook sent Leo crashing to the ground. A side effect of street life. He'd learned to fall so he'd take as little damage as possible. Like an expert stuntman. But the stars danced in front of his eyes. He felt dizzy, and the light seemed a little dimmer. Theo smirked and lifted his leg to consolidate his success. But his puny body was pinned against the wall. Cops. What the hell is this? Theo said indignantly as his arms were pulled down with a police collar. How dare you, huh? I'm in a free country. Read me my rights. Shut up, the cop replied and pinned the former boxer against the wall. He probably lost a good half of his teeth from those blows. I'll read you your license. Not on my street. Hey, man, you need some help? That question was addressed to Leo. He touched his injured cheek. It hurt, but it was bearable. Theo must have hit it half-heartedly. His teeth didn't even wobble. No, he couldn't go down to the station. First of all, the boxer could add to it in the car. 2, the other guys would think he's a snitch. Theo's own fault, he got himself in trouble. 3, they'll be sure to make a report on him at the station. "It's all right, officer," Leo replied, getting up. "I'm looking for a job. I've been begging recently, honestly. I haven't quite figured out what it's all about yet." "A job?" The cop asked incredulously. "That's right. Begging, is not Christian. For your diligence and humility, you're entitled to a special prize. Here you go." He handed him a coupon for the lodging house. "That's lucky. For the second day in a row, he could shower and sleep in a bed." The coupon came with a $10 trip to the municipal cafe. Of course, they'd cheat him out of his money and give him a glass of tea instead of a Coke. But it's better than eating a bun and port again. "Thank you, officer," Leo bowed. "I feel much better. Permission to go." But the cop was no longer paying any attention to him. He turned around and pushed Theo in front of him, and he was eager to turn around and say what he thought about law and order in this country. But the policeman had a firm grip on the detainee's shoulder, and he could only express his indignation with his back. Tucking the coupon into his pocket, Leo raised the mug in front of him. But because of the stupid bruise on his cheek, the stream of change had dried up, and so had his desire to collect it. Today, the townspeople were shying away from him, reluctant to throw coins. By 1 p.m., the vagrant had collected a little more than $1. Soon, however, a cafe would open where he could redeem the coupon. Then buy a bottle of port and get really drunk. The things Leo regretted weren't easy to count. He was about 40% regret himself, like whiskey made of alcohol. His father was stingy, even though he was literally sitting on money. His investment fund was considered one of the strongest on the West Coast. There was a minimum of servants in the huge house, and the table was bursting with treats only when there were guests. The rest of the days they ate not so much poorly, but not richly either. His father forbade Leo everything and demanded complete obedience. He, the only child in the family, felt like a black sheep in the company of his peers. While the other children of rich parents bought expensive toys, taken to the best resorts in the world, he was forced to listen to his father's admonitions. He paid only for the bare necessities, or he had taste. At some point, the parent decided that it was time for his son to stop moving the bag. "Your first car," his father said, handing him the keys to a red Cadillac. "You have to drive something to the school building, right?" Leo was speechless at the sight of it. His father had many cars, a whole collection, but he rarely used them. Mom even drove a mass-produced Honda. Not a bad car, but clearly does not match the status of a millionaire's wife. Cadillac, against this background, looked like an alien from the planet of luxury. "Dad, are you serious?" then asked Leo, not believing his happiness. "Yes, but..." and he immediately came up with a whole bunch of terms and conditions for using the cars. They were stupid, but on the plus side, Leo wasn't going to abide by them. He couldn't wait to drive his beauty up to campus and park it in the faculty parking lot. Hardly anyone would say a word to him. Contrary to his father's wishes, his son grew up to be a spender. He went to expensive clubs and restaurants, bought things in boutiques, and sometimes even just squandered money. All of his son's financial shenanigans were covered by his mom. She somehow wrote off his expenses, transferring them to his father's fund. Leo didn't want to go into details. All that mattered was that everything was nice and decent. How old was he then? 22, I think. The joy of owning a collector's Cadillac was short-lived. His parent passed away, and Leo discovered a terrible truth. It's been many years since the foundation, one of the strongest on the coast, went bankrupt. By some unknown inertia of luxury, the family had been living in debt all these years. Neither Leo nor his mother had noticed the telltale signs of financial insolvency all that time, though they might have. As soon as his father died, there was no one to fend off the attacks of creditors. The expensive collection of cars went up for auction, as did the luxurious house. All that survived was a red Cadillac, his mother's jewelry, and some personal effects. And that, if not for the advice of a lawyer, they might have given the creditors even that. Leo sat down at a beggar's table away from the main hall. He can't go near the handouts. The police might be called. All that's left is to wait for an employee to take the coupon and ring it up. The morning breakfast was long forgotten, and Leo was starving. And thirsty. Finally, a cafe employee appeared near him, and the vagrant held out his coupon to him. "So waiter," Leo began. He was in a good mood. "I'll have an aperitif to start with." But the social worker didn't appreciate his joke. He took the tear-off coupon, threw the rest on the table, and disappeared. For a long 20 minutes, the tramp waited until he was served his legitimate food. Finally, the cafeteria employee brought a pathetic cutlet, a small spoonful of mashed potatoes, bean soup, and a whole plate of bread. And that was for $10. What about the selection? Leo was indignant. Where are the vegetables? Where's the cheese? Eat what you're given, the employee said, or I'll call the cops. You'll go hungry, understand? The hobo sighed and started eating his lunch. The big advantage of mashed potatoes, cutlets, and bean soup is that you don't have to chew them. Along with the human form, the street takes away the teeth of its inhabitants. Even if you protect them like the apple of your eye during fights and police interrogations, diseases are bound to do their work. Leo chewed and thought that 10 years ago he would have just walked past a cafe like this. But today he considered it a great fortune to dine there. Paul had gotten used to being hired for all sorts of nonsense, but even for him, this assignment was too much. It's one thing to find a cat or a dog. At least that's where his profession as a private investigator comes in. You call trapping services, drive around shelters, and try to compare a picture of the animal with the one you're offered to pick up. But following a stray? Yes, he has the proud distinction of being a retired police officer on his resume. He spent 20 years looking for criminals with mixed success, so he understood the ins and outs of the craft. But the initiated know that his resume should have been read between the lines. After all, Paul retired, but without a pension. It was the usual way for those who got knocked up. And he, being retired, had no pension and no obvious prospects. So he took on everything, even such a ridiculous assignment as following the vagrant. He named his usual rate of $100 a day, and the client did not even flinch. At first glance, it seemed like a lot of money. But in fact, after all the deductions and taxes, after gasoline and dry cleaning, there was a pittance left to live on. And he didn't have a job every day. The client paid well. He made it a rule never to argue with customers, and it really worked. He made notes in his notebook during the conversation, but it was more for show. Paul's memory had not failed him so far, and he easily memorized all the information. To follow the strange guy in the drab coat, to find out as much information about his past as possible. But there was a hitch. The detective knew the homeless too well. And to get any information at all, you have to do a lot of work. Optimally, you have to become homeless himself. Paul used his own channels to confirm the name Leonard, and then, just in case, to get more information about the client. Her request seemed very strange, and the name too familiar. He should have turned Cindy down, if only because he'd been involved in the case in the past, but he needed the money too badly. He also wanted to get to the bottom of it. Paul reported his findings not only to his client, but also to Mark. At some point, he even felt like he was back in the service. He longed for both the badge and the gun. In a few days of stalking the homeless man, he'd made some progress. For one thing, he got Chris to give him the note. She didn't even have to pay extra. She already knew him well enough to help him. Secondly, to realize that the tramp's heart was scratching. Paul couldn't believe that the same major had turned into the dregs of society. Fate is a villain. Alcohol must be to blame. At first, his client's assignment seemed nice. To trace, to photograph, to plant a note. But her new assignment looked strange even for this series. Out of old habit, Paul only nodded and agreed. After all, he reserved the right to run the errand for himself. As soon as they said goodbye, the private detective immediately went to the phone booth and started looking for change. This attribute of the past had almost left the streets of their city. Why the booths when everyone has a great phone in his pocket? Only great individuals like him must have continued to use the booths. "Hey, Mark," Paul said, "you sit down there and get a firm grip on the table. Even a dry guy like you might not be able to take it and break." When Luke was out the door, Mark took out a cigarette and lit it. He liked his tobacco the strongest, the kind that made you all chipper. The investigator felt he was wasting his time. Today was exactly 10 years since Kindy's body had been pulled from the cold water. This case had gone back and forth so many times that Mark had lost count. Now Cindy's gonna come to him again, only not so young, and play the old record. "Understand, detective," she'd say 5 minutes later. She couldn't have committed suicide. The day before, she'd shared her plans with me. She was going to be picked up in the morning by that major. The one I've told you about 100 times, but you're in no hurry to check my story. Mark nodded, but his heart was beginning to boil. An experienced policeman, he never argued with relatives of victims or injured parties. He tried not to interrupt. But Cindy was a special guest. She was testing his patience like no one else. He's gonna snap any minute now. Oh, come on. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. So many years have passed, and we still don't know if it was really murder. Even I'm not sure, you know. How are we going to convince a court of law? Cindy cried. What a stiff-necked jerk. Of course, the woman has a tragedy. Her sister died falling off that cliff. Mark's already ruled 10 times to dismiss the case. He's made a convincing case for why Kendi would do such a thing. He reported that he'd never been able to locate the big guy in the red Jaguar, but there were still doubts in his heart, and some theories were still being tested. Here, Cindy said, holding out her cell phone. I recognize this car. Take a look. Without much hope, the investigator looked at the screen. Of course, it's not a Jaguar, it's a Cadillac. Just one detail, but what an effect. The car, of course, is luxurious. Those toys that are now coming off the assembly line and in the footsteps of the cars of the 80s. They knew how to do it. We recently went to a retro exhibition with my husband, said the girl, wiping her tears. And there I saw this car. Of course, I could be wrong, but it looked very similar. Did you take a picture of the license plate? The investigator asked hopefully. The girl took her cell phone and started moving the pictures around. She took a good 100 pictures of the Cadillac. And only on one of them the license plate number could somehow be made out. Luck. Mark dumped the pictures onto his computer and transcribed the license plate number. Immediately, he sent a message to the chat room to have the guys in information services prepare a full background on the car. He should have the file any minute now. Turns out he hadn't done everything. Every time Mark took the case, he had mixed feelings about it. On the one hand, it bored the hell out of him. On the other hand, he wanted to solve the mystery. It was probably because of the scandalous case that his career never got off the ground. It's been 10 years since he's been stuck in the district. Thank you, Mark said with a smile. I'll do my best. I'm sorry I snapped, miss. The girl was silent and wouldn't leave. She didn't like him, did she? Cindy had gone from redneck to strong and confident woman before his eyes. She seemed to be a designer and even a success. Every year she looked better and better, and the cars she drove to the station were more and more in line with the average person's idea of a successful life. That's not all. Cindy stretched out. I think I found him. Who? Mark was surprised. I think that girl decided to finish him off today. The killer, answered the guest in a broken voice, but this time she didn't cry. The other extreme of life on the streets is immense boredom. Once the basic needs are met, the beggar has nothing else to do. And out of boredom, vagrants start doing all sorts of obscene things. They drink anything that burns. They start other people's cars, climbing into open houses. After a heavy lunch, Leo was not even lazy and went to the bathroom to wash his hands properly and get all the crumbs out of his beard. He looked at himself in the mirror. Yes, it looked really scary. His black hair is tangled. His beard ages him 10 years, and that's at least. Dirty clothes all at small and large holes. It seems like in his past life Leo washed his hands before eating, and he didn't have a beard at all. He didn't want to go to the crossing, and there was nothing to do. Beggars don't have hobbies. His failing eyesight and lack of habit don't even allow him to read books. Besides, when you immerse yourself in the story, you become too open-minded. Someone could steal your backpack or something. That leaves alcohol. The tramp counted the coin and small bills in his pocket. It was an impressive sum, for which he could buy 2 or even 3 bottles of port. But he might not be allowed into the lodging if he took so much fuel into himself. Even for him, the Castellan would not make a discount. So it was necessary to buy a bottle, go inside and drink it right in the bathroom. There was still plenty of time before the lodge opened, so Leo decided to just walk around town. So when his father died, he thought he was truly free. Bankruptcy didn't scare him at first, because he just didn't believe in it. His mother didn't survive the financial collapse and ended up in a community hospital. Leo initially visited her a few times in the first year, and what he saw made a lasting impression on him. We're fabulously rich, Leonard, she used to say when we met. See how big my house is? Only the servants won't give me my china for some reason. Can you tell them to put it up when you arrive? Some philanthropist has given an outdated mansion to a hospital, and Mother feels like she owns the place. And the doctors and staff are personal servants. Mother even tried to keep track of expenses, like in her own home. She didn't rampage at all, so her antics were treated with humor rather than anger. Everyone was amused except Leo, so he found it best not to show up at the hospital. His father had died just in time. Leo was finishing college and preparing for a career in finance. He was not going to become a clerk in someone else's fund and slowly, step by step, rise to the top of the stock market. Leo sold his luxurious Cadillac to some collector for a substantial sum of money, not only because he needed the money, but also to forget about her. After all, Candy's eyes sometimes appeared in his mind's eye. Leo started his own foundation, trying to make a splash in everyone's eyes. Like his father, he was trying to build a financial soap castle. He must have succeeded if it hadn't been for his parents' collapse. But his last name became a curse, not a mantra of success. When the partners heard it, they were slow to hand over huge sums of money. And the stock market is a conveyor belt. The abilities, which were so often talked about by teachers at the university, for some reason did not bear fruit. Lack of experience undermined the budding financier. And gradually Leo lost everything, including his dignity. The fund went bust, but it took him only a few months, not decades like his father. Now, walking down the street in his rags, Leo doubted the reality of the past at all. Had it really happened to him? Or had he dreamed it in the same cellars and lodgings where he suffered after cheap wine? After experiencing a second collapse, Leo fell into despair. A regular job was out of the question. Perhaps at the beginning, he could have gotten a job at a bank, become a paralegal or a salesman in a salon, but he didn't want a handout. He wanted to be at the top of the pyramid, not at the bottom. After the failed fund, he borrowed a lot of money from friends from his past life. Anyone who could give him any decent amount of money claimed he was about to inherit. Leo was still very persuasive back then. They believed him, and he didn't skimp on future interest. Having collected a substantial sum, the young man began to think about where to invest it. And this time, for some reason, he decided to play in the casino. His impeccable education instilled in him the false idea that playing the system will definitely bring a big score. If the agony of the fund lasted for several months, then the effort in the casino only a couple of days. Going out on the street without a penny in his pocket, Leo realized that now no one would ever trust him with a bill larger than $20. There was only one way to the bottom of the pyramid, which he was so eager to conquer. Next came a trial and 12 months in prison. He was even released a few days early for good behavior. Life in the State House finally managed to reconcile him with reality. He will never rise to the top, never become a goldfish or at least a jellyfish. He's left to wander on the bottom. Years passed. Leo attributed his financial failures to karma. He didn't know the universe. He owed it a huge debt. If the first month on the street you are still making plans, dreaming of returning to normal life, then a year later it is no longer possible. The smell of sweat ceases to bother you, and leftovers from the supermarket tank seem not the worst option for breakfast and dinner. Over the years, he's realized that his fall to rock bottom started with that very trip, and the crime he committed. To forget, he had to drink wine. His feet carried him to a cheap store where, even with his paltry sum, Leo could feel like a king. But suddenly he froze, hesitating, afraid to cross the street. On the corner stood she, and seemed to be looking in his direction. She looked left and right and started to cross the street. Leo wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. Mark had no illusions about going to the rich estate. It seemed to him that he was wasting his time, and that the rich people were just mocking him and his old fort. Surprisingly, the person on the other end of the line did not refuse to look at the Cadillac, but asked him to drive across the street for the servants. He also promised not to report anything to the newspapers, although the investigator did not even think about it. The servants rode. Mark resented it as he drove down the highway. Then he had to turn onto a narrow asphalt road with trees overhanging it. A huge estate opened up before him. The owner definitely had taste, because the house was perfect no matter which way you looked at it. Drive through, the guard waved his hand, looking at the documents. They're waiting. Over there. He could use a map to get around the estate. Mark drove up to the huge building and almost physically felt his own squalor. What he thought was a gymnasium turned out to be a giant garage. Waiting for him outside the building was a real butler. Despite the hot weather, the man wore a white shirt with some strange ruffles and a black jacket. "Good afternoon," nodded the butler. "We are pleased to welcome you to Mr. White's manor. He has readily responded to assist in the investigation. Mr. White was unable to receive you himself and asked me to convey his deepest apologies. The fact is that a gentleman from the government is visiting him today. If necessary, I can invite them both." "No need," Mark replied. He tried to hold himself loosely, but he clearly lacked the necessary manners. This is, an unofficial visit. I'm investigating a very old case. Oh, don't get me started on the details. The man asked and opened the door. They entered a glass room. Let me show you the whole collection. And you can choose the car that is of interest to you. We are ready to provide it for inspection at any time of the day or night. But we can't seize it. There's hardly a judge in the county who'll sign a warrant. Come on in, but don't forget to wear booties. Mark walked into the garage and literally couldn't believe his eyes. It was as if a wizard had enlarged his son's cars and arranged them in perfect order. What was there? Expensive Ferrari, Jaguar, Mercedes, Aston Martin. Mark walked across the perfectly white tile floor. In the garage, he saw 3 engineers in white coats examining a vintage American, the make of which he couldn't name, and marking something on their clipboards. Yes, that's it. The investigator nodded at the red car. The butler kept pace with him. Mr. White doesn't just collect cars, the butler said. He also shows them off to the world. If a car has a criminal history, we can help unravel it. I don't think the Cadillac is guilty of anything, the investigator shrugged. He opened the door to the cabin, peered inside. Surprisingly, the butler didn't ask for gloves, but was wiping everything down with a napkin. I looked in the trunk. So many years had passed. What had he hoped for, Billy? The car looked sterilely clean, like it had just come off the assembly line. The specialty of this model is the interior, the butler said. It's a one-of-a-kind car. Pay attention to the inner trim of the air duct, steering wheel, gearbox overlay. Only 100 examples of this saloon ever rolled off the assembly line. As you understand, only a few have reached our days. Do you remember who drove it before? The investigator clarified. In fact, he knew the answer to this question. Of course. I myself purchased this stunning specimen. The car was in terrible condition, Butler said. It was obvious it had been used as an everyday car. That's not acceptable when you're talking about collector's virgins. But most surprisingly, a suitcase was found in the trunk. The previous owner was so absent-minded that he even forgot to take it out. I doubt he even looked in the trunk. That's interesting, said the investigator. Can you describe it? I'm talking about the suitcase. Come on, I'll show you, the man shrugged. I could throw it away, but such things should be handled with care. Mark and the butler went into a room in the garage. The whole wall was taken up by drawers, like store lockers. The man took out a huge magazine, checked some records, and approached the box. He opened it with a universal key he pulled out of his jacket. No way, Mark exhaled, taking the suitcase. Fantastic. Hallucinations are a sure sign of a mental disorder caused by alcohol intake. But they can visit a person not only during heavy drinking. It is enough not to drink for a few days, and here you begin to see something that in reality does not exist. To stop the trembling in his hands, Leo begged a glass of instant coffee from the Help for Everyone tent. The taste was disgusting, but the caffeine was doing its job. Leo had one question. Had he really pushed that girl off the cliff? I think he'd seen an obituary in the local paper, but he wasn't sure anymore. No one had ever questioned him about that day, never asked him if he'd gone to the lakeside, never charged him or detained him. What if she didn't really exist? The same questions could be addressed to himself. There was a psychologist on duty at the Help for Everyone tent. That was exactly the kind of specialist the vagrant lacked. It was strange, of course, in his position to ask such questions, but there was no queue of those who wanted to talk to the specialist anyway. Hello, said Leo. If I may, I'd like to make an appeal. I've been plagued by intrusive images lately. They keep appearing in my head. Yes, of course, the woman nodded. Call me Al. I'm always at your service. We've gotten 100 of your coworkers back to normal. That's exactly what she said, coworkers, as if vagrancy wasn't a state of mind, but a profession, or a disease that can be cured. Leo was indignant, but he decided not to show that he was boiling inside. Maybe this woman would really give him some good advice. I have a simple question, but you must understand, said the tramp. Let's say I can't get over a girl. She comes to me everywhere. This is the 3rd time I've seen her. And others, Yes, the psychologist nodded. What was her name? I don't know, Leo lied. How long did you two know each other? I don't know. Does that bother you? What's the problem that I can help you with? Leo was silent, but not because he had nothing to say, he was just afraid. Yes, he didn't know if Kendi really existed, though he didn't want to say her name. The problem was something else. He didn't realize if he really existed. Are the other beggars calling him Prince because he went to an expensive college and was once a financier? Or were they just mocking him? Did his past really exist? Or did he make it up, like a writer composing an adventure story? All these thoughts must have come from the lack of booze. It was the third day he'd been sober. If he made it all up, if Leonardo never existed and was only a beggar Leo, then his girlfriend did not exist. From these thoughts became quite bad. The beggar thanked the psychologist and smiled, but the woman only wrinkled her nose. He must look terrible. There was only one way left to confirm his own realism. Leo went to the other side of town. He stood in a giant line at a barber shop for beggars like himself. Two specialists in medical masks were cutting and shaving a huge crowd of people. The odors of the place could make an inexperienced person faint. When the procedure was over, Leo went to the mirror and took out a photograph. He always kept it close to his heart, as a reminder of the old days. It showed a young man in an expensive suit and yellow tie, smiling at 32. The smile wasn't real. I picked up the photo to compare it to myself. Eyes, nose, chin, and forehead all matched. It's really him. So in the past, Leo really was a financier and the son of a bankrupt millionaire. My legs started to ache from the long walk and standing. Urgent rest. The beggar began to rummage through his pockets to find a coupon for a night's lodging. Lost it. He took off his backpack, old and greasy, began to inspect all the compartments. Then the ridiculous coat he wore in almost all weathers. Jeans. The damn coupon was nowhere to be found, and he was counting on a bed, a disposable toothbrush, and a sandwich. Finally, the coupon turned up crumpled at the very bottom of his jeans pocket. Leo exhaled with relief. On the way to the lodge, Leo pondered. Everything that had happened to him was not a fantasy or a play of imagination. It gave him hope. On the other hand, he had killed that girl. He killed her, but he'd gotten away with it. It made my soul ache again. It's nice to know that you're healthy, that you're not crazy, and bitter to realize you're a murderer. 6 o'clock at night. The bed and breakfast is just about to open, and the best place is available. Leo chose a bunk at the very end of the room, on the first tier, put his things on it. This time the Castellan gave out a toothbrush and a sandwich in a clear bag. The beggar looked at it. No foreign papers. So that other co-workers wouldn't encroach on his place, he left the backpack behind. Anyway, there was nothing there that could be of interest to the inhabitants of the lodging house, and they usually steal at night. For a few cents in the basement, he could wash his clothes, and Leo decided to take advantage of the opportunity. Then he washed and cleaned himself up. After the barber shop, he looked almost like a normal person. That night, after a third day without alcohol, he slept surprisingly well. As always, he dreamed about bits and pieces of his past life, his parents' luxurious house, college, going out to restaurants. He felt great in the morning and thought he could really get back to normal. Look for a job, a temporary place to live. Leo opened his backpack to put a brush and a baggie in there. Disposable or not, you decide for yourself. This one could really be used more than once. My hand came across something that shouldn't be in the backpack. Leo took out an envelope, opened it, and got cold. Mark wanted to push the gas pedal to the floor, but held back. You have to be careful. 10 years have passed. One day or even a month will not solve anything in his investigation. That's why he had to keep a cool head. Now he would go to the station, scrutinize the suitcase in front of Cindy, of course. He's already got her on the phone, and then he'll decide what to do. He had a secret too. Many years ago, he found the very major Cindy was sure existed. His name was Leonard Farber, a small-time crook, son of a victim of financial fraud. Mention of him lived only in the operational file, to which only he and the operatives had access. And the inspectors, but they rarely held such papers in their hands. True, no charges had been brought against him 10 years ago. Yeah, he and Candy were seen together. She was selling flowers at some rich guy's bar, so they could have met there. Theoretically, Leonard could have killed her, but why would he? In that dramatic year, he lost his father, his fortune, then tried to make money, but in the end he lost even more money and even went to prison. They even put an experienced agent in his cell, but Leonard kept quiet. He was angry at the whole world, but not because of the girl's death, but because of his own bankruptcy. Then the tiny time limit came to an end, and traces of the major were lost. When Cindy showed him the tramps picture, Mark had mixed feelings. He was both amused and sad at the same time. She had found the major after all these years. But Paul had already told her about it, in great secrecy, because a private investigator should not share the results of his research with anyone. Leo was apparently down and out, so he disappeared from the investigator's radar. But the photograph of the car in which he could give his victim a ride changed everything, as well as the suitcase, which inexplicably why kept the courteous butler of the exemplary billionaire. "It can't be," cried Cindy, going through the clothes and shoes. "These are all hers. I gave this shirt to her myself." It was clear that Candy was not living on a budget, the bare minimum, and they were all cheap. 2 pairs of jeans, 1 dress, tights, some underwear, and a toothbrush. Even the suitcase was penniless. It didn't have a proper lock. If they had found the car and the things in it 10 years ago, it would have been possible to conduct expert examinations. But now, years later, no traces could have been preserved. "Let's sign the inspection report. Here and here." "I'll keep investigating," Mark promised, but Cindy didn't want to leave. Mark specialized in cold cases. His department had a more poetic and sinister name for cases that coffins didn't want to investigate. That's right. Such cases can bury any career, even the most dedicated and careful investigator. In the early days of his career, nothing was going to go wrong, and he saw the county job as just a small stepping stone to a future career. "His name is Leonard Farberg," Mark sighed. "A unique man who went from rich boy to pauper." "You mean you knew who he was?" Cindy was indignant. "And you kept quiet?" "Understand, there's a mystery to the investigation," said Mark. "I'm more surprised how you found him on the street in the first place." "I don't think he's changed at all," Cindy shrugged. "Candy told me about him." "You have to realize there's no direct evidence," the investigator said. "Although he won't be able to hire an expensive lawyer anymore. If we press charges, anyone will be willing to work with him. Because such evidence is a sure acquittal, we need concrete evidence. Witness, but we canvass the entire side. No one saw this guy there, or his confession. But if he's been silent for so many years, why should he talk?" Cindy smiled. He must have been the only one with secrets. She was certainly a prominent girl, and her sister, judging by the pictures, was a beauty. Mark always felt remorse when he had to investigate the deaths of young girls, as if he was responsible for what happened. "Do something for me," she asked and lowered her eyes. "Something special." Mark blushed. In his years with Cindy, he should have known she liked him as a man, but this was completely unacceptable to him. After all, he had a wife at home, even if they hadn't been getting along lately, and the children. But just as the investigator opened his mouth to express outrage, Cindy continued. "Go there, to that cliff. That little boy will tell you all about it. Only you, 'cause you know the whole story." "Wait a minute," Mark said. He already knew what she was getting at, but he decided to look surprised. Only in the movies do criminals return to the scene of the crime. How are we going to get him there? On what grounds? She told him her plan, and Mark grinned. That's a good one. For some reason, amateurs think they can investigate cases as they please. It must be time to file this case away for good. Let Cindy complain. "Do it for me," the girl asked. "It's been 10 years since I've had a real life." "All right," the investigator said in surprise. "I'm in." For such tricks, Paul could well be disbarred, and then the only way out was to become a bouncer in some club. He avoided that fate as best he could. At first glance, being a security guard seems easy. In reality, you have to stand around all night long, and if you're not in good health, it's not easy. And a bouncer can always get punched in the face by angry customers, so you have to keep in shape. No, that's not what Paul will do. He's going to do the bidding of a strange client who's been watching too many soap operas. 2 days ago, he'd already put $10 in that tramp's hand while he was passed out in the crosswalk. It was his own fault. He shouldn't have hit on a man who was just going to get coffee. But that time Paul was like bringing a stranger to his senses. It was acceptable. Today, the task was more difficult. Slip him that envelope without him noticing. The private detective nodded to Chris and went into the big room. He had dressed in old clothes, especially for following the vagrant. Basically, he could pass for one of these unfortunates. Pretending to choose a more comfortable bunk, Paul began to look for Leonard with his eyes. He wasn't there. His backpack was on one of the beds. Definitely his. There was a small emblem of the Red Cross on the front. They must have given him the item as humanitarian aid. He walked over to the backpack and looked around. No one. He took out an envelope, opened the zipper. "Hey, you." Someone called out to him. Paul didn't turn around. "Yes, you. I'm talking to you." The detective heard footsteps approaching him. One of the lodgers, destitute, dirty, angry. He looked at Paul with distrust. "What are you doing here?" "Same as you," the private detective muttered. "Weren't you trying to cut off my purse?" The guest asked. "I can see you poking around." "Why is it yours?" Paul asked. "No." "That's good," said the detective, "because I lost one just like it the other day, with the same cross on it." "No, man, it's not yours," the lodger said and smiled. "It's Prince's purse. He's had it for a year, no less." "All right," Paul grumbled, "but I'll have a word with him. He's a bit of a tattletale." "Hey, where's your stuff? You want to trade?" The detective nodded vaguely toward the hallway. This talkative drifter was starting to get on his nerves. Did he think he was going to spend the night? "Well, cheers," Paul said. "I'm going for a smoke." The beggar gave him a surprised look. He had cigarettes, and he didn't even offer them. This one must be a new one. He still looks quite decent. There are only a couple of holes in his t-shirt, and his sneakers aren't intact. Maybe his wife kicked him out of the house. The next day, Leo saw her again from a distance. She was looking at the clothes behind the window with the most interested look. It was her, and she looked like she was continuing to age with him, though she shouldn't have. But the vagabond wasn't as surprised now as he had been the day before. Coincidences like that just don't happen. There was an envelope in his backpack, and inside it was $20 and a one-way ticket. Lakeside. From that day on, Leo never visited that place again. At first, he was just afraid to go there, and then apparently he didn't have enough money. Today, however, he woke up with hope. Since he hadn't seen a body, maybe Candy wasn't dead. Maybe she lost her memory or had no claim on him. Leo stepped out of the lodge and approached the window behind which the mirror stood. After 3 days without alcohol, a haircut from the social barber, and laundry at the lodge, he looked almost normal. They definitely let him on the bus like this, which meant a trip to Lakeside. Why not? If she survived, that explained everything. That's the reason he's seen her the last couple days. But Leo didn't dare approach her. It wasn't far to the train station, and on the way he visited the canteen to get a proper meal. It wasn't a long journey, and he had $20, a fortune at his present time. He wanted to drink coffee again, once any morning started with this invigorating beverage. After breakfast, Leo found his bus, handed the driver his ticket, and took a seat. Over the past few years, he had grown accustomed to rudeness and was worried about whether he would be allowed on the bus. But after a haircut and a wash, the trip didn't look as bad as usual. The driver didn't say a word, just took the ticket and tore it up. "You can choose a seat." Leo sat down by the window and put his backpack next to him so that no one would keep him company. In his years of loneliness, he had completely forgotten how to talk to people. Only his work phrases about how hungry he was, how tired and cold he was, and that he needed a few coins. Beggars don't have friends on the street. There are, of course, exceptions to the rules, but the alleged mutual aid of the homeless is simply a myth. It was a long ride, and Leo dozed off. He had already forgotten that blissful feeling of sleeping on a bus while traveling. Very few people went inside with him. Lakeside was usually visited in the afternoon or evening. The place had long ago become a must-see on tourist itineraries. As crazy as the plan was, it worked. The guy got on the bus. What's more, he went straight to the train station. Paul couldn't understand the man's logic. And then there was Mark's indecision. Maybe if they had questioned him properly years ago, he would have confessed to everything. "Hello, Mark." He sat down. The detective dialed a number from his notebook. "Excuse me?" There was a woman's voice on the other end. Paul hung up. "Oh shit. Good thing I called from a payphone. I've got to get the investigator and the client mixed up. It'll be a scandal if the truth comes out. Okay, don't panic. We need to stick to the plan." "Mark, are you there?" The detective dialed another number. "Yes," the investigator answered. "He's on his way," Paul said. "I don't know if he's gonna make it. He just got on a bus." Silence. With these phone booths, you never know when you're going to lose the connection. The detective banged the phone against the wall a few times. Maybe it helped, because he heard the familiar voice again. "I'm here," Mark answered. "I don't like this whole thing." "Wait," Paul continued. "I accidentally dialed this one. What's her name?" "Cynthia. And I called your name, Mark." Cindy, the investigator, was surprised. Did you talk to her? No, but she might have recognized my voice. Deny everything, Mark replied. You realize we both could get hurt. Paul walked toward the office. The case with this tramp was probably solved. Let the lady settle up with his assistant. He's not going to talk to her anymore. I can't believe he's doing this kind of nonsense. I wonder why it worked. And he'll go back to his unfaithful husbands and wives, kittens and dogs. Less pay, but no risks. Leo dreamed about the trial. He'd already been through that shame a few years before. All the newspapers had trumpeted that the son of a famous financier had followed in his father's footsteps. But he did it so ridiculously that he made the honorable public laugh, not with annoyance. He ran up debts, but he didn't even pretend to be in business. Just lost everything in the amusement arcades to end up in the dock. Leo memorized by heart the most caustic article about himself and his father. Risk-taking and fraud are twin brothers. Leonard seemed like a great guy. Friends, girls, expensive suits. No one could even imagine that this good-looking guy, whose first startup went bust, wouldn't even look for cryptic wording. He was simply borrowing money against a profitable business, promising 20% annual interest. On the scale of the world economy, the amount Leo took possession of was not so large, and not all of his creditors went to the police, who wants to look like a fool. If it were not for the sound name of Leonard, this case would have drowned in the hundreds of other similar cases and passed unnoticed. He didn't even have money for a lawyer, so the court appointed some old guy. He didn't understand anything about the stock market or investments, so he slept through the whole process. Only once in a while he woke up and inserted some remark, not always in the right place. Leo was lucky. Thanks to his full confession of guilt, the judge showed unprecedented humanity and imposed a symbolic punishment. The tramp woke up, glad that it was only a dream, that he didn't have to go through the shame once again. Yes, if he was tried for the murder of a pregnant woman, he could hardly expect mercy. He'd probably spend the rest of his days behind bars. There was nothing wrong with prison, by and large. There was certainly more order there than on the street. But Leo decided to himself that he would never go back behind bars again. And in his years of wandering, he had never once been to a police station, although he could get arrested for vagrancy. The secret is simple. Never stay in one place for too long. Keep moving. After 3 hours on the road, the bus finally arrived at the terminus. It was almost lunchtime. It was as if Leo had gotten a second wind. After so many years outdoors, his arms and legs usually ached. His knees and spine were aching. But today, he felt surprisingly good. So he decided to climb to the top point on the very cliff where his fall to the bottom began. The place has changed and become more cultured over the years. A secure fence has been installed along the entire hiking trail. It must have something to do with Candy and her untimely passing. Down at the bottom of the hill, there were souvenir shops and a few cafes. Leo wanted to finish his business as soon as possible, but he was in no hurry. He went into a cafe, ordered a coffee and a hot dog. He drank the drink with pleasure. It was amazing how people's attitudes toward him changed when he cleaned up a bit. No one kicked him out or threatened to call the police, and the sales girl even smiled. Once upon a time, when he wore expensive suits and ties, he would have definitely taken advantage of that smile, but not today. There were only a few cars parked in the huge parking lot. There must not be much of a crowd here on a weekday. The weather is beautiful, just like it was then, years ago. The fence made it easier to walk, and Leo was quickly at the very top. He walked to the edge. Hello, he heard a voice and turned around sharply. The tramp almost slipped from surprise, but grabbed the fence with his hand. I apologize for scaring him. In front of him stood a man dressed like a typical detective. Hat, gray coat, white shirt, though it was a fairly warm day. Shoes instead of comfortable sneakers. I wonder how he climbed that mountain in them. Even if he didn't utter a word, his affiliation with the police would be immediately clear. Good afternoon, Leo replied. To what do I owe the honor? My name is Mark. I'm investigating the case, the man replied. It seems you're the one I've been waiting for the last few years. Would you like to tell me something? Yes, Leo sighed. I do. And it was pure truth. It must be that if he had met the detective even a year earlier, he would have denied everything. But that didn't make any sense today. Leo was just tired of moving from place to place, and also from the eyes he saw in front of him, but realizing all of that was only possible here. I'm sorry, the drifter shrugged. I'm sorry, but I can't help it. Ever since her sister's death, it was as if Cindy had lost the best part of herself. She didn't believe in suicide for a second. And when the pathologist told her about the pregnancy, Cindy was ready to tear down walls. Of course, he was the golden boy who threw her off the cliff. And even back then, years ago, she realized why. Cindy felt sorry for herself for not demanding that her sister stop hanging out with the major. She felt that this guy would bring her no joy. But the police didn't seem to agree with her reasoning. Such a complicated case was entrusted to the dumbest investigator on the coast. He never found the red car that the major used to drive Candy to the vacant lot. Didn't even find him, though there weren't many children of rich parents in the neighborhood. He dropped the case a dozen times and started over after she complained to the top. At some point, she just accepted that it would be Mark who would investigate the case and decided to cooperate with him. She turned to private detectives, fortune tellers, approached expensive restaurants and cafes where this major could be. Only after 4 years, she finally learned his name and was able to get a photo. Turns out, he stopped being a major right after her sister was murdered. If that's a punishment, it's a very weak one. Cindy tried to get her life back on track. She graduated college, became a designer, got married, even had a baby. But she still had an emptiness inside her, a hole in the place of the part of her soul that had filled Candy's. And so she went back to the station again and again, talking to the investigator and trying to convince him that she was right. He never argued with her, willingly listened to her, and for the first time he snapped only recently. At the same time, she was looking for the major herself, but he seemed to have fallen through the ground. He'd been in jail for some financial thing, and then he disappeared. Mark, that tight investigator, convinced her there was no evidence anyway, and he didn't seem intent on bringing the case to trial. Until one day she accidentally found Leonard herself. There was a new beggar in the passageway she went down every day. Like a true artist, she was always looking at people. Maybe she'd see something in their profile, sketch them, and though she'd never seen Leo, the murderous major, in person, he'd given himself away. The way he looked at her, like he was seeing a ghost. Cindy had to hire a detective to follow the drifter, get his name, and take his picture. Cindy couldn't believe her eyes. Leo had sunk so low that he had definitely hit bottom. Only her eye of a seasoned artist could recognize in the beggar the golden boy who had driven Candy around and probably sent her to the other side of the world. When Cindy hired a private investigator, he too made surprised eyes. But he knew his job, and within a couple days, he confirmed her hunch. The overweight retired man didn't know what she was interested in. But he didn't ask any questions. After all, she was paying money. He had somehow managed to slip the note and put the envelope with the money and the ticket in his backpack. For some reason, Cindy was sure Leonard wouldn't stand for it and drive to the lakeside. And there he'd meet a policeman and, out of surprise, tell him everything. All she had to do was be patient and wait, so that after all these years, justice would be served and retribution would find its villain. And if it hadn't been for that phone call today, she would have kept waiting. She could have sworn it was a private detective talking to her, and I think he gave her the name of an investigator. Did they really know each other? Or had Mark come out to him himself after her strange request? Mark had taken up position on the hill earlier in the morning. The bus ticket Cindy was talking about didn't have a departure time, only a date. So the drifter and part-time ex-major could arrive at any moment. Of course, the plan seemed fantastic to him. Not only did Leonard have to show up today, he'd have to want to open up to him, tell him everything that was on his mind. Even talking to Paul wasn't reassuring. Let's say Leonard got on the bus, but what's stopping him from getting off? He could change his mind by the time he got to Lakeside, or make surprised eyes when he asked a question, or even get angry and pick a fight. Well, that's unlikely. Beggars don't usually show aggression. Gathering for this strange task, the investigator for some reason did not think about the fact that he would have to wait for the tramp to appear in the blazing sun. His hat offered little protection, and his shirt was quickly soaked. "They never looked for me," Leonard replied. "No one asked questions. I wasn't hiding from anyone. I waited for them to come for me, even made up an alibi for myself. But you never came. And that waiting was eating me up inside. Well, the investigator smiled. So I came. Better late than never." "Yes," nodded the tramp. Even after the confession, he was not relieved. Rather, he was filled with fear. Now the newspapers would be sure to go after him with renewed vigor. If they remembered, of course. Over the years, his name may well have been forgotten for the social media. Although, if we're talking about solving a murder from 10 years ago, the case is solved, Mark said. I think the court will take your remorse into account. Come on, son. What's next? Leo asked. He didn't move, but clung to the fence as if he were dizzy. The usual, sighed the investigator and took out a cigarette. Precinct. Protocol. You'll have to write a confession so the court won't take it out on you. I'll put in a good word with the prosecutor so he'll be loyal. And then, the beggar asked. I don't know, admitted the investigator. Prison, I guess. Hunger came back again. Mark thought it would be a good idea to go to a cafe and get something to eat. After all, this hobo-turned-major was almost like a relative to him. He knew almost everything about him. Prison? Wrong, Leo said, swam over the fence and took a step forward off the cliff, and flew into the void.
Darkness had always seemed to Angelica a living thing, and as long as she could remember, she knew that something lurked in it, waiting for the fateful moment, something that wanted to harm her. You are quite big now, her mother said to her, putting her to bed for the night and carefully adjusting the blanket. Don't you realize there's nothing there? It's all right here, silly, her mother said, tapping Angelica's forehead affectionately with her finger. Come on, grow up soon and nothing to be afraid of. On this inclement, thunderous night, standing in front of the window, the girl remembered her mother, who was gone a little more than a month ago. The still young woman had faded away in a matter of weeks after doctors had told her she had cancer. How had they looked it up? Nobody knew. Just Angelica's mom thought that fatigue is from work, from household chores. And now her daughter is all alone. Wrapping her arms around her shoulders, she pressed her forehead against the cold glass and stared into the darkness, the first floor of the house, and it seems that there, beyond the window, the abyss. It was well past midnight on the clock, but Angelica didn't even think about going to bed until the footsteps, the fumbling of her stepfather in the next room, were hushed. He was drunk again, and when he was drunk, Angelica was almost more afraid of him than of what lived in the dark. In fact, John had demanded that she call him Daddy from the very beginning as soon as he entered the family 4 years ago. But Angelica had never uttered the word for him. Yes, she didn't know her real father. Her mother had never told her anything about him, but John, never could he be a real daddy to her. And no amount of candy and toys and sweet words about how much he loved his girl could change that. And when he tried to give her a kindred hug, Angelica felt the grip of a snare. Angelica learned about snare, by the way, early because her grandfather kept one in his collection of antiques. Grandpa had his own room, and it always seemed to Angelica a cave of treasures. What wasn't there? Huge books, colorful rugs, strange pictures that her grandfather Robert called engravings. A big globe, not at all like the ones at school. And about the huge trap, her grandfather said it was a 19th century antique. When Angelica was little, she couldn't understand what the 19th century was. Even what her grandfather said didn't help. It was a time so long ago when even his own grandfather had been a baby. Robert also said that this trap had once been used to hunt special, magical wolves. But Mama didn't like that kind of talk. She said that because of them, Angelica would never stop being afraid of the dark. Mom sometimes even demanded to throw this thing away, saying that even though it lies on the shelf, but still somehow uncomfortable, the aura in the house is spoiled. But grandfather only waved away and said that the aura, if it is at all in nature, spoiled people, but not things with a good family history. Daughter. Stepfather's quiet voice at the door pulled Angelica out of her silent stupor. She shuddered and turned around. Angelica, open up to Daddy. You're awake. Are you afraid of a thunderstorm, little girl? The nightlight is on. There. She clenched her teeth. What kind of little girl is she to him? A week ago she turned 18. But no celebration, of course. Shortly after her mother's funeral, no wish. Just that day had passed and that was it. Her stepfather only got drunk in it again and kept repeating that time flies, and she for him will always remain a daddy's daughter who belongs only to him. In general, the stepfather said strange things when he was drunk, and when he was sober, he did strange things. For example, he loved to move things from one place to another. For example, the mug Angelica used to drink tea from in the morning, and then began to say that no, He did not touch anything. It is with her head something apparently is not so. Go away, please. I'm tired. I want to sleep. Go away, you're drunk. Angelica's voice sounded unsure. The stepfather outside the door seemed to run his fingernails over the door. No, the stepfather exhaled hoarsely and the door opened. He stepped into the room, closed the door. What are you running from me for, huh? I won't hurt my girl. The stepfather licked his lips and Angelica felt nauseous. Suddenly, his hand reached out and put out the nightlight. Small in the form of a lantern, from which on the walls danced figures of forest animals and close to the stars. It was a gift from my mother long ago, and every night burned until morning. Turn it back on. Angelica's voice trembled. She couldn't bring herself to move from her seat. No, it wasn't completely dark in the room after all. There were lights burning in the yard, and the lightning seemed to strike without ceasing. But the disappearance of the source of warm, soothing light struck a whiplash on her nerves. Afraid of the dark girl, the stepfather was getting closer. What do you want? Let's talk tomorrow. I'm tired, Anne. Do you want to go to bed, my girl? The stepfather licked his lips again and hiccuped drunkenly. Angelica gasped, her body trembling. If now to rush forward and jump out into the hallway. You can wake grandfather. He will calm him down. Grandfather, though he was already 70, was not afraid of John and always protected his daughter and granddaughter from his drunken antics. Except that the stepfather was ahead of Angelica and rushed first, right at her. He dug into her shoulders, pressed her against him, turned her around and pushed her onto the bed. Her scream froze, not breaking through the sweaty hand clamped over her mouth. What, do you think you become a big girl and can disobey your father? She's already 18, so everything is possible, pot stepfather. Angelica desperately resisted, but the forces, trivial simply by the weight of her stepfather and her, were not equal. The belt buckle jingled. Tears in the girl's eyes clouded everything around. Nightmare, darkness, the worst fears that she hadn't allowed to fully materialize in her head until now had become reality. Angelica snapped out a low, pitiful moan. But the one who hovered over her, it did not stop, only seemed to inflame even more. A big one, so muttered the stepfather in a slurred tongue. You're already out with the boys, aren't you? And Daddy then aside. Well, nothing. I'll teach you how to obey. And suddenly the door opened. The light on in the hallway illuminated the figure on the threshold. Grandpa. In an instant, he was beside her, and then some force simply yanked her stepfather off Angelica, tossed him aside like a sack of garbage. Barely, with difficulty, she realized it was her grandfather who had done it. But he always seemed so weak, and here, sitting up on the bed and correcting, returning the pajama shirt torn by a ruthless hand to her bare shoulders, Angelica opened her eyes and watched as her stepfather, who had barely begun to rise, took flight again, now against the wall. Grandfather just stamped him, and then hit him in the face with a full swing. John yelled something, tried to swing his fists back, but the forces were not equal, and in addition, he was tangled in his own pants. Finally, grandfather gave him a final, from the heart, as they call it, a blow, from which the stepfather just howled and began to roll on the floor. And the next powerful blow, grandfather clearly deprived him of his senses. Angelica, the grandfather turned to his granddaughter. Get dressed. Grandpa, she started, but the stern look immediately canceled any talk and slowness. The girl grabbed a sweater, jeans. Grandpa grabbed her stepfather by the scruff of the neck and lifted him off the floor. Not exactly carrying him, but dragging him. Grandpa, don't kill him, Angelica exclaimed. Well, what are you? Grinned the old man. Teaching enough for a start. What we will do. What are we going to do? Angelica froze. We'll leave. Right now. What? Oh, granddaughter. I should have waited for nothing. I thought maybe he would come to the senses. You see, he's lost his human face. No, we're leaving now. I've already decided where to. You obey your grandfather and pack your things. I'll call a cab and I'll lock him in the back room. He'll wake up in the morning, knock on the neighbor's balcony. He won't be lost. He'll live. Although, such a creature. With a hum, grandfather disappeared into the corridor. Angelica acted, feeling as if in a dream. Take out the bag. Leave what was at hand. Oh, how lucky that recently in the room put in order and at least did not have to look for long documents and all the necessary little things. The tears had not dried up yet, but the girl was laughing nervously. What's going on? 5 minutes ago, she was suffocating under the disgusting weight of someone else's body, and now she's packing. Where to? Why now? Anyway, she didn't want to stay in this house. Mommy, you're gone, the girl whispered and slammed the desk drawer shut, grabbing her mother's last but most precious box. It was an antique, carved thing, in which she kept memorable little things different, as she herself said. And when Angelica was just a little girl, she loved to play with them, going through them as if the contents of a treasure chest. Ready, Dragonfly? Grandpa's back. Far away in the apartment, there were drunken shouts of her stepfather, who had apparently already come to his senses and was pounding on the door, locked in the room. Instead of answering, Angelica nodded. She went out into the corridor, then to the landing. Grandfather didn't lock the front door, just closed it. Now to the elevator and down. Why are we leaving? Where to? Angelica asked when they stopped at the elevator. Robert didn't answer right away. He opened his umbrella to hide himself and his granddaughter from the rain, then stretched out his hand and caught the cold stream of water in his hand and hummed, rubbing it between his fingers. He'd been thinking about it for a long time, about how it couldn't go on like this. Robert was silent when his daughter Celine decided to get back together with John. She decided, as she said herself, tired of being a woman alone. I brought up Angelica. She will be an adult soon. She will leave and what? I will be all alone then, she said indignantly and at the same time justifying herself. Yes, I made a mistake. I made a terrible mistake. My whole life was damaged. But what am I to do now? To be alone to even like it seemed that they were happy. Angelica's mom was so young when her daughter was born, only 20 years old, and it was not a planned child. And the father of the daughter, it was possible to consider that there is no at all. That is, roughly speaking, biologically, of course, he existed. But in that murky, dirty, cruel story revealed enough burning truths that Selena refused any connection with this man. Only her father trusted the truth, and he, feeling immensely guilty for allowing what had happened, agreed with her. Although he sometimes realized that no, he could not have prevented it. To be more precise, he could have. If Selena had told him everything at once, instead of being alone with her misfortune. In general, the father-daughter bond could have broken, split like an iceberg under the impact of waves, but it was Angelica's appearance that became the saving glue for her. The baby gave them strength, gave their lives meaning. Angelica had been dusted off. No daycare why, when there's a grandfather who, possessing a sharp, developed mind, taught the little girl to count and write, looked after her, and along the way before he retired and after, generously spent on her most of his salary. She was his historian and culturologist, specializing in folklore, not that great, but with what the accountant received Selena, for the needs of the family was enough. Angelica grew up a quiet, domestic child. She went to school, but she did not make many new friends. In general, with her and in the yard drove few people. Not because of her odd fear of the dark and a sensitive attitude to the fact that sometimes count the surrounding objects were so noticeable, no, about it only the closest knew. Simply Angelica was very timid, shy, did not show initiative in games, but she studied well. She obeyed her mother, and Mom was quite happy with that. She only sometimes regretted that there is no in her daughter a bright palette of emotions, that fire that happens in other children. But then every time mentally said to herself that even be happy about it should be, maybe the daughter of her mistakes will not repeat. I wish Angelica never had to go through what she went through in her time. Grandfather Robert also saw how his granddaughter was growing up, but it did not bother him in the least, because he noticed something else. Angelica was so sensible and intelligent beyond her years. So what if she doesn't run around the yard with the other kids, but as Peanuts cracking tasks from math and physics textbooks, eagerly argues with him, an old man about the deep meanings of the legends of Eastern Europe, and by heart can retell the most important dates in the history of Constantinople, not forgetting all the names of important persons of that time. Sometimes the granddaughter talked to her grandfather about the future, about what she wants to become, and every time she kept saying that she wants to be like him, also to study history, culture, folklore. Wouldn't you get bored? Robert asked with a sly squint. It's more work in the office. It's not an adventure with treasures, as in the movies. But it's interesting, answered Angelica invariably. And you can work very much alone. What are you? You do not like human society. Are you a bear, which and alone in the wilderness of the forest is good? Once asked his grandfather. And if I am a bear? Replied Angelica. He is big. No one will hurt him. No, grandfather. I love people. It's just, I think I'm something else. You're the only one, Robert grinned, and the best granddaughter I've ever had. And that, believe me, is even more important than science. And even if you become a fool and forget your alphabet and your name, I will always and always love you. Much later, looking back, Robert thought that he would not have allowed that Selena got together with John. But as if an evil fate, then Robert spent almost 2 months in the hospital, first finding himself there with pneumonia, and then, on the eve of discharge, had a heart attack. And when he returned to the apartment, it turned out that Selena not only brought a man, but also had time to sign with him. And she was determined that this was her last chance at womanhood, and she demanded that John be registered in the apartment. She said that if she didn't, she'd leave. She'd pack up her things and her daughter, and she and her husband would leave. Robert, with a broken heart, agreed to everything, but he kept an eye on his son-in-law. Scolded him when he drank in the first years, John as if obeyed. He worked, however, in different places, then a loader, then a guard at the warehouse. But Selena blossomed with him. She started wearing makeup and dresses, cooked a delicious dinner for the return of the spouse because she worked near the house and had time to patronize. Selena never tired of talking about how happy she was. Robert, after his illness, when one led to the other, suddenly began to feel guilty. That because of the long-standing fatal disobedience of his daughter and a keen desire to take care of his granddaughter, condemned Selena to a lonely woman's life. Robert had repeatedly told John that he was a stranger here and had no right to bring up Angelica, in general should not get too close to her. What are you going to do to me, old man? John snapped at him. You yourself will fall apart soon. You don't get out of hospitals. Actually, that was only half true. Robert was really old. He tried to take care of his health. He was a head taller than his son-in-law, broader than him in the shoulders, and in principle, he never complained of feeling ill after he came out of the hospital. Robert always believed that men in their family were strong. His own great-grandfather had lived until he was 104 years old and had kept a large farm in the village until the last, commanding everyone so that even the mice went on a string. Robert did not run himself, ate without excesses. Morning began with exercise and even went to the gym, bought a subscription. Which, by the way, very funny, Selena. If you want your father to be an old man, then I'm sorry, my daughter, there will be no such thing. Yes, he's sick, like all people. But is that a reason to suddenly abandon yourself? Time passed, and one day Robert realized no. John was looking at Angelica for a reason. The bastard suddenly began to throw phrases that here she will be 18, will be a bride, will be a girl in the very juice, and it must, therefore, from the grooms to protect. Robert could not listen to how Selena takes these speeches as a joke, even happy that stepfather, you see, ready in advance to protect the honor of stepdaughter. When it became clear that Selena is sick, Robert suggested let's sell the apartment, start treatment. He also offered to sell his house in the village, but she was against it. No, I can't do that to Angelica. This is her future. She needs a good place to live. And me, I guess it's my time. I guess it's for the way I used to be. Robert felt like hitting her for the only time in his life, just to slap her so she'd come to her senses and stop talking nonsense, because he'd long ago decided for himself that what had happened wasn't Selena's fault. She was just too young. She didn't go to anyone for help. They could have just left, fled to the city, and then, after his daughter's death, the only reason Robert didn't collapse into the black abyss of despair was because he knew Angelica needed his help. He realized that with John further to live under the same roof they cannot. He was not ashamed to drink at home, and on all attempts to talk shouted that he was in grief and in general he was registered here. Robert decided to do otherwise to move out, taking Angelica with him, of course, and then already sell the apartment. Slowly began to learn everything and the place where to leave, prepared. But here's how it all turned out, that I had to hurry. And now when they were standing at the entrance, all these events and decisions of the past flashed before their eyes. Grandpa, where are we going? Maybe we should go back in. Okay, Dragonfly, listen to me. Robert turned to his granddaughter and put his hand on her shoulder. I thought I'd tell you everything later, well, as it is now. We can no longer live with this man. You yourself, a big girl, should realize what he's like. I'm an old man, of course, but I'll take care of you. There's a place where we can stay while we decide everything. We'll leave town. Grandpa, what about it? I have to prepare to enter next year. What about me? There's a library in town. Angelica did not realize that her thoughts were occupied with such trivial matters of the future, but they rose up in her mind like a barrier protecting her from the aftertaste of the attack. You will, Robert answered. The time is September. You'll have plenty of time to get ready for admission. I'm sorry, Dragonfly, he added more quietly. I should have taken you away earlier. The old fool. I kept thinking that I had to finish this and that. To hell with everything, just to keep you safe. It's not your fault, Grandpa. Angelica's voice trembled. Why did Mom bring him? He's. Your mom just loved and did not listen to her mind. It happens in life. Well, granddaughter, do not cry. I want to go back and unscrew his head. Angelica sobbed and hugged her grandfather. Don't. Let's really just go away, even to the end of the world. And where are we going? To your friends? No, Dragonfly. We'll go to my small homeland, to the village of Boars. Boo, that's all the girl could say. She would have been less surprised if her grandfather had said that they were going, say, to Paris. Angelica knew that this village was somewhere far away, but she had never been there. Her grandfather had once told her, when she was still a little girl, about those places, about how free and beautiful it was there. But then Mom heard it and yelled at Grandpa. She said she shouldn't tell her daughter about it. She'd had enough of that damn place. But it was such vague, ancient memories, and Angelica did not ask anything about it now. The abominable attack of her stepfather had put the girl into some sort of trance. She was now ready for anything, just to be away from here. Finally, the cab pulled up. The driver, a chatty and smiling guy who introduced himself as Vasily, loaded the passengers' things and under the story about what an unusual shift he had today, took them to the station. And the owner of the pug said to me, "Don't worry, we are calm today. What does he do when he's not calm?" I do not envy her husband. Gilbert the guy, carefully taking a place in the parking lot. That's it, here we are. What time is the train there? We'll make it, answered Robert, counting out the bills with a bounty for the trip and for tea. Grandpa, have you bought tickets already? Angelica was surprised. No, but the nearest one is leaving. Robert glanced at his wristwatch. In 3 hours, if there are no tickets for it, then we'll go next. Grandpa, will he be looking for us? Who knows? But don't be afraid, smiled the old man. I won't let him hurt you. Now let's get to the Boars, rest, and slowly get on with our lives. Look, Dragonfly, there's a 24-hour buffet. What do you say about the pies? Unhealthy, fried, but tasty. I will, smiled Angelica. Luckily, the train tickets were available. Robert paid for a whole compartment at once so that not a single living soul would not interfere with the journey. Unfortunately, we don't have grilled chicken and boiled eggs, but there is a restaurant car, so we won't starve. Give me that bag, granddaughter. Careful, put it here. Something jingled in the bag. Robert carefully placed it. Angelica frowned. It felt like a box. Grandfather, is there a trap in there? Robert nodded. Grandpa, you told Mom you were going to throw it out. Yeah, that came out badly, but that memory is mine. That trap? What's that? Oh, Dragonfly? I'll tell you later, but for now, he doesn't ask for food and drink, and he won't jump out from under the shelf. Won't bite, right? So forget him for now. Forget him. Let's better make the bed and you go to sleep, or look, quite sleepy eyes. Angelica agreed. Now, under the measured clatter of wheels, when with every moment the train carried away farther and farther, she suddenly felt so tired. Still, however, wanted to wash to wipe with a washcloth all traces of touching stepfather, but now it was impossible and therefore could wait. Early in the morning, when the dawn was already dawning, grandfather woke Angelica to admire the view outside the window. It was really a breathtaking sight. The train was rushing past the river, on a vast meadow in front of which cows were grazing. Summer was running, flying to the end, and the cattle were walking on the last succulent grasses. A little later, they took tea and breakfast was served by the conductor, and Angelica plunged into what she loved more than anything else in the world, grandfather's story. He told her what they would soon pass by, and then the view of a half station or some village acquired a special, deep, and fascinating meaning. "What are we going to do there, grandfather?" "To live, granddaughter. We've spent too long in the city, and you've never seen anything but it in your life. I have a house there." "A real one?" Angelica gasped. "Well, not a toy," Robert grinned. "It was built more than a century ago. It has a solid piece of land. True, almost everything stood unattended." "What do you mean, almost?" "Well, there were people to keep an eye on things so they didn't fall apart. But all in all, we'll live in a wilderness, granddaughter. But believe me, that's what will do our hearts good now." The road took a long time. Sometimes we went out at small stations to stretch our legs. And also, grandfather always bought something to fried seeds or homemade dry fish. Angelica tried it all with apprehension, and even tears. Mom would not approve cooked by unknown person. Unknown in what conditions? But Angelica also believed her favorite grandfather. "Grandpa, well, what kind of village is this?" Angelica said in surprise, diving out of the screen of the smartphone, in which she had been sitting for the last half an hour. "Almost a city already." "Yes, the Boers have changed, but fortunately, civilization is slowly coming, and the spirit of the old, as they call it, lives." "And you, what are you? Quite urban at me." "What else?" Angelica shrugged her shoulders. "Ed, that's what I mean. Consider, the real life has not seen." "No, I should have been more determined, and at least sometimes to bring you. Look, and would not have grown up such a boo." Sending her grandfather a smile that understood his joke, Angelica returned to the information she was studying. In general, it was very interesting. The first settlements on the place of Kabankiki appeared at least 400 years ago, and still in these parts remained a lot of architectural monuments of the 19th and even 18th centuries. The house of the merchant Volkov now turned into a museum, where the objects of old times and some archaeological finds were demonstrated. Not far from the village, the reserved territories began, and probably, as it was said in one of the articles, it was the proximity of truly untouched nature that explained the fact that the forests were not reserved, but the most ordinary, almost adjacent to the Kabankiki, were so unmodern. In other words, they were happy in the proper seasons with an abundance of berries and mushrooms, and there were also all sorts of animals: hares, martens, and even moose, and someone said wolves. In the latter, however, the journalist who wrote the article doubted very much and specified that wolves had not been officially seen in these parts for 100 years, so that all these stories were no more true than the rumors about werewolves that had been going around in Kabanchiki for ages. "Grandpa, is there a fence at our house?" Angelica suddenly asked. "There is a good fence. It's good enough to keep out strange cattle." "Are the doors and windows locked?" "Why do you ask, granddaughter? Are you afraid of robbers?" Playing mysteriously with his eyebrows, grandfather asked, and Angelica smiled involuntarily. "It's just that we will live alone. Don't be afraid. Outside bandits don't climb there. Thieves too in Kabankiki. There are no for about 30 years. Why? If you know too much, the Martins will take you to the forest." Grandfather said something incomprehensible and wagged his finger at his granddaughter. Angelica shrugged her shoulders and changed her occupation, though she had few people who could be called friends in the city, and it was necessary, of course, to inform them that she had left. At last the train stopped. The usual fuss began to take things, check that nothing had been forgotten, and come back for what had been forgotten. Then we waited for the bus, and having mixed up a little, almost went in the opposite direction. In short, by the time we finally reached Kabanchiki, Angelica felt tired. But of course she looked at the sides, at what opened her eyes. It was hard to say that it was a village. if we were to be guided by a classical idea of it. Asphalted road, modern buildings, post office, stores. In the distance could be seen the roofs of solid such houses. Robert explained that it was squeezed into the territory of Cabanchique Cottage Village, like a cottage, but with a considerable number of such properties in which they live all year round. But soon all this was left aside. The air was fresh and possibly fragrant, filled with the aroma of meadow grasses. The wind carried the freshness of the river and the distant mooing of cows. Angelica suggested taking the cab when they first got off the bus, but Robert said it was ridiculous to walk 5 minutes. But it must have been half an hour, and with the way the luggage was dragging their hands, it seemed like an eternity. They passed all the houses in the village. Angelica felt strange, because they did not stare at them, but some of the old men suddenly began to say something to others at their appearance. Angelica suddenly thought about the fact that her grandfather never really told about his past life. That is, about the time before he moved to the city, and it now seemed strange. After all, with Robert, it seems granddaughter about everything in the world could communicate. So why wasn't this period of his life covered? I could not believe that his grandfather had nothing to tell about his youth, but what he told was scraps, as if from the ancient story torn out pieces, erased some of the words and so presented, and unclear to you and curious to the horror of what is there, in fact, what is there. "Wow, Grandpa, is that your house?" marveled Angelica, when finally they got out of the village, or rather left the last of its houses a few hundred meters behind them. Grandfather and granddaughter stopped in front of a 2-story brick house with a tiled, once must have been red, but now lost the richness of color roof. The windows were boarded up. The paint had peeled off on the walls, revealing the brickwork. The girl thought suddenly that the house looked like a huge, lying in hibernation beast. A long period of idleness had made it quite heavy, clumsy, and the fur on its sides had piled up, in some places falling out, exposing the base of the hide. What nonsense comes to mind sometimes. Shaking her head and shrugging her shoulders, Angelica approached the wrought iron fence, covered with some greenery, touched the black bars with her fingers. It seemed that it had been painted at least last year. Otherwise, it would have rusted for so many years. There was a shrill, howling squeak. Grandfather opened the lock on the gate and now with effort pushed it forward, opening it. "Welcome to our domain," he said importantly to his granddaughter, lifting his hat above his head. Grandfather had always, for as long as Angelica could remember, loved hats, and in summer he always wore light-colored sailcloth hats, which made him, together with his neat beard and mustache, look like an ancient professor. This resemblance, by the way, even did not spoil the habit of grandfather to wear undersuits, not shirts with ties, and t-shirts from youth stores bright, with bold prints and bold inscriptions. The porch of the house inspired apprehension, but it didn't fail when Angelica climbed it. It was her turn to unlock the doors, and they creaked open with an equally shrill creak. "Oh, what a mess." Robert shook his head. "I'm going to have to work here." "Is there heating?" Angelica asked, suddenly worried about the comfort of her new home. "From the boiler in the basement. I bought a new boiler 3 years ago, but it was idle." The girl only shook her head. It was surprising and strange that the grandfather cared so much about the place where no one lived for many years, in which they did not even go on vacation. True, now it became clear that when grandfather left, as he said, on business, he probably came here to see how the house was. A spacious hallway with a wide staircase going to the second floor created the illusion that the house was much more spacious than it seemed from the outside. Watching her grandfather, Angelica thought that he took such an abrupt departure much more calmly than she did. With a most nonchalant look, armed with the appropriate tools, Robert proceeded to open the windows. Not all of them, of course, he said, but he would first make the rooms they needed habitable and then do the rest. "Here's the kitchen." Grandpa walked his granddaughter through the house like a master tour guide. "We cook with gas, so tomorrow I'll go to the village shop for a cylinder." "Grandpa, the village shops are over. That's the old name," shyly corrected him Angelica. "Well, to the store. The essence is the same. Everything can be bought." The kitchen slightly frightened Angelica. Gas stoves seemed to her in principle beasts incomprehensible in handling. And the place was so dirty. "Yes, we need to clean well. as if her grandfather read her thoughts. So that we do not suffer, I'll bring tomorrow a worker from the village will help us. Come on, I'll show you the living room. Grandpa, it's just like in a museum. Aghast, the girl, when from the furniture were pulled down, accompanied by rising clouds of dust, which had become white and beige from time, cloth covers. Angelica had noticed even earlier that inside the house looked very old-fashioned. Under the ceilings there was fanciful molding with bunches of grapes and some figures of either people or animals, and now the furniture was found, natural wood it seems. The girl ran her fingertips over the lacquered surface, sighed, unthinkable, and all this beauty was idle for years. She even felt sorry for the house. It was a strange thought, but Angelica thought that if it was not just a building, but a living being, it would probably be a shame for it to exist alone like this without owners. Is the fireplace real? I asked my grandfather, and he answered with a nod. Then we went to the second floor, where according to Robert there were living rooms, and a couple of guest rooms, and also a study. Well, let's take these, the old man decided, showing his granddaughter the two rooms next to each other. And although he said nothing, it seemed to her that her room had once belonged to a woman. It was indicated by the look of the bed. Its four posts were covered with carvings with floral ornaments, and there was a table with a triple mirror against the wall. The girl wrinkled her nose at the wallpaper, which must have come from the 50s, but in this room on the wall by the bed, it was literally falling off, and it was clumping up alarmingly. But since she was going to live here now, or rather live here for a while, she had to put up with everything. And to get used to it, Angelica decided to put some of her things in the room as soon as possible. Her mother's jewelry box on the table with mirrors, her favorite nightlight on the bedside table. The girl froze. Then she rummaged through her bag once more. The nightlight was gone. No, it was not lost. She left it in the room of the city apartment. Forgot. Oh, dragonfly. Like a little girl, honestly, sighed grandfather when Angelica shared her sadness with him. But it's not good to sleep with the light. Grandfather, please don't start, Angelica said, almost crying. She herself realized how stupid it is, 18 years old already and afraid of the dark, but she couldn't help herself. I'm not swearing. Robert waved his hands. It's nothing like that. Before, in the old days, even adults were afraid of the dark. It was normal, especially in villages like this one. He added more quietly, and then hugged his granddaughter. Well, keep the phone on at night. Put it on the nightstand. I'll look in the village shop tomorrow. Maybe they have lamps, or you could light a candle. No. Angelica calmed down and even smiled. I don't want a candle. What if there's a fire? And in the old days, how did they live with them, eh? And nothing did not burn everything and everywhere. So then, probably skillfully. That's right, Robert nodded. In the old days, we lived without the internet, but in many ways we were smart, and in some ways we understood more than we do today. Well, now that we've looked around, granddaughter, let's walk back to the village and get something for dinner. I'd order sushi too, Grandpa added in a hooligan tone. But I'm afraid the delivery zone doesn't extend to the Boers. You should get some rest, Grandpa. Angelica hated to be weak. After all, she's so young and Grandpa's old. Why don't I go? You just write down what to buy. Okay, you agree? Before going to the store, still found out that the water supply in the house again has heating from the boiler, and in principle the quality of water is not frightening. So Angelica went shopping almost in a good mood. It was nice and strange at the same time to walk along the empty road, listening to the silence. No, of course, the silence was not absolute, but against the background of the city noise seemed just fantastic. As it turned out, there were several stores in Kapanchiki, but Angelica was lucky to go straight to the largest one, where everything on the list was available, and also, to her delight, nightlights were available. Angelica chose the one in the shape of a bear in linden pink color. The saleswoman behind the counter did not interfere with questions, but still asked if it was true that Robert had returned. They said they saw him, walking towards the manor. Well, Angelica stretched out, not really knowing what to say. We won't be long. To rest? Fine, said the saleswoman and looked at her strangely. Give him a bow from us Sidorops, and tell him the walkers still live here too. And the stones remember. I will, Angelica rounded her eyes. She hadn't expected her grandfather to be such a famous person, but apparently just lived here his peers and maybe he wrote them letters. Finally, loaded with bags, Angelica went outside. The sun was slipping towards sunset, having changed the gold of light to a soft crimson tone. The girl was suddenly touched by the thought that dusk would soon come. Surely she would make it back before they did. How annoyed she was with her own silly, groundless fears. The road home was winding ahead in a ribbon. Angelica passed a woman with a full basket, by the look of it, of the early mushroom harvest, and the girl made a note in her mind to offer her grandfather to go mushrooming. 4 goats also passed by. The animals kept in a flock and drove them barefooted boy, who paid no attention to the new resident of Cabinchiqui, too absorbed in the fact that not to let run away his small herd, and in addition still hummed under his nose some song. "Girl, do you need a ride?" The rustle of tires of the car approaching from the back and the voice of the guy who stuck out from the driver's seat took Angelica out of the state of pleasant, almost meditative thoughtfulness. "No, thank you," she replied politely and even smiled, and quickened her step a little. Not that Angelica was afraid, but it was somehow unpleasant when you are alone on the road, the darkness is getting closer, and behind you a car with 4 strange men crawls. "What are you doing?" One of the guys in the back nodded. "Hop in, we'll give you a ride." "Are you afraid?" The driver grinned. "Why so? Are you a city girl?" Angelica shuddered. "Only this is not enough. What to do now?" "Turn around and go back to the village where people are. Drop the heavy bags and run?" "Hey, what's the big deal?" A new participant in the events unfolding in the dwindling twilight approached from the direction of the village, just like the car, but on a bicycle. It was a tall, blonde-haired guy wearing glasses with round, old-fashioned glasses, and Angelica, though the situation did not dispose to the thoughts of outsiders, but thought that he looked something like a student from the old Soviet movies that her grandfather liked to watch. Even dressed similarly, plaid shirt, vest on top, but the jeans and sneakers, of course, are quite a modern detail. "Hi, Alexander," gritted his teeth and averted his eyes the guy who was in the driver's seat of the car. "Nah, just offering a ride." Well, the blonde grinned and slowed down completely, stopped the bike, so that he was exactly between the car and Angelica. "Would you ride?" "Come on." Another guy from the car spoke up. "We didn't do anything wrong. I'm sorry." "All right, let's go, guys." And the next moment, the driver hit the gas and the car sped forward, and there, a lot farther on, turned at a fork, now heading somewhere towards the city, like somewhere. "Is everything all right?" The blonde turned to Angelica. "Thank you," she smiled. "Yes, you saved me." "No," he replied. "It's Max and his friends, they're locals. Hooligans, of course, but generally harmless guys. But their company seems to have frightened you." "If only a little. I really recently came here, only today. I came with my grandfather." Completely dared to communicate with the stranger Angelica and waved her hand, pointing to their house. "That's where we live." "Oh, so Robert's back," the boy said thoughtfully and sent Angelica a very strange look. "May I offer the chivalric services of a chaperone? We're kind of safe here in general, but still, I wouldn't want to interfere with your plans," Angelica said in a hurry and blushed embarrassed. "You're not interfering because I'm just out for a walk," the blonde replied. "I'll help with the bags at the same time." He patted the basket on the bike rack with his hand. "Thank you," Angelica agreed, still embarrassed. "If it really doesn't bother you. By the way, we haven't introduced ourselves." He held out his hand to her. "Alexander." "Angelica," answered the girl. The handshake was firm, and so they moved forward. They started talking, so about insignificant trifles, but by the time they reached the gate of the house, Angelica for some reason began to feel that she knew Alexander a long time ago. She opened the gate, expecting him to drive forward, but the guy stopped in front of them, unloaded the bags, returning them to the owner. "Maybe," Angelica swallowed nervously. "Would you come in to see us? You know, to say hello to Grandpa and have a cup of tea." "Thanks, but no. I have to go," answered the guy and looked very strange again. "Well, okay," shrugged Angelica. "Bye then. See you later." The guy replied and turned his bike around and rode back. Angelica decided not to tell her grandfather anything, because in fact, nothing particularly important or interesting had happened. They hastily prepared dinner sandwiches, drank tea with cookies, and went to bed. Angelica slept unexpectedly well at the new place. She had a wonderful dream, which was equally frightening and exciting because usually the girl saw something ordinary, a repetition of her everyday life, their routine. But here she was in the village, or rather in the yard of their house. Late autumn was raining on the trees left rare, brown, and dried, disturbing rustling leaves. Angelica stood in the yard, dressed only in a light dress, more suitable for the warm days of the passing summer. She stood and was afraid to turn to the house, because she knew inside none of the rooms no lights were on and something was watching her from the windows. Something big and evil. And then behind the gate, which opened by itself, as if under the hand of a ghost, there was a big dog. Black with silver fur, it grinned suddenly and Angelica realized it was not just a dog. There was something of a wolf in it. The beast was formidable, but the girl knew for sure he would not offend. And then what was in the house? A dirty fog crept onto the porch, and the sky darkened sharply, twitched with storm clouds, and the air smelled her proximity. But the wind also dryly drove the leaves, did not spill a drop. Angelica took a step forward, another, snapped at a run in terror, realizing that what is in the house is already reaching for her, is about to grab. She fell, pain hit her knees. She stretched her hands forward in despair and her fingers sank into the thick, warm fur, and her gaze met the yellow eyes of the dog, in the depths of which smoldered red coals. The beast radiated strength, aggression, and hunger, but it did not want to hurt her. Angelica somehow knew that he wanted to save her, except he couldn't. Please, it was the kind of dream where you scream, tearing your voice, but barely a whisper comes out. Let me in, the wolf answered, his voice somehow sounding like the roar of a beast, and a young man on a bicycle at the same time, rang out right at the girl's head. I can't, said the wolf. First you have to invite me in. Angelica had already opened her mouth to say the cherished words, but then the fog caught up with her. It touched her ankles and yanked her back, and her stepfather's nasty voice sounded behind her. There you are, my girl. Angelica woke up, jumping up in bed and gasping for breath. Outside the window was a clear, golden dawn. The house became noticeably cooler. Probably it was worth adding heating. Pulling her knees to herself and wrapping her arms around them, the girl squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head, as if finally shaking off the dream. What a dream. In the morning, grandfather announced that he was going shopping, and also for an assistant. No need, Angelica said. I can do it myself. You think, Dragonfly? You're a hard-working bee and you know how to do everything, but there are a lot of worries here. Nothing, the girl answered cheerfully. There will be something to do. Will you be back quickly? Maybe we can go to the woods later for mushrooms. That's a good idea, smiled the grandfather. We'll do that. By the time he returned, Angelica, of course, had not managed to do everything, but still the most necessary rooms were cleaner. We went to the forest. It was fun, especially when the grandfather began to strictly correct his granddaughter's clothes, as it should be to ensure that no gnats or ticks did not bite. Angelica had a very vague idea of the mushroom variety in the wilderness, and so grandfather's detailed story about what you can eat here and what not, accompanied by all sorts of simply curious facts, came just right. Grandpa also told a little about the locals, and Angelica decided to open up about what happened yesterday. I don't know Alexander at all. Robert shook his head. But I think we should invite him to tea. If only as a courtesy. Tell him if you see me insisting. We walked in the forest until late afternoon, and there we had another snack of sandwiches and coffee from a thermos. They unanimously decided to have dinner with mushrooms and fried them with potatoes. Angelica's grandfather didn't let her do it. He said that there are dishes that he, doesn't trust anyone. At dinner, we did not utter a word. Too tasty, everything was too delicious, impossible to distract. But then, when grandfather, again without any help, brewed a fragrant tea, it was time to talk. Robert told his granddaughter that they had come, of course, to rest. But it was also time to seriously deal with his life. I think it's time for you to learn something about our family and why your mother has been alone for so long. Perhaps I should have told you about it sooner, but I once made a vow to Celine not to tell you anything, but I think that was a mistake. I'll be honest, granddaughter, I feel like I'm betraying my daughter's memory, but I can't keep quiet. There are things you can let go of, but you must know, and we'll start from afar. It turned out that the ancestors of Angelica's family on her mother's side were scientists, at least in 4 generations, and all of them attracted not exact sciences, but history, literature, folklore. Therefore, in many ways they were happy to take in the family of Angelica's grandfather, because he did the same thing. Angelica's great-grandmother on her mother's side was, as it became fashionable to say in the modern world, psychic, and it brought her fame, but not particularly good. But personal happiness was not. In the end, this intelligent and talented woman, as Robert said, went crazy. Your mother was under the impression that this was not the first woman in your family named who, shall we say, had peculiarities of consciousness. Your aunt. Well, what's an aunt? My grandmother's next of kin, let's call her that, was sleepwalking. My wife, that is, your grandmother, she was afraid of water since childhood, and you know what fortune tellers told her? That she had drowned in a previous life, and she so believed that. So sorry for the details, but even the bath refused to take, and our vacation, if we went to the sea, turned into an unbelievable thing. She wouldn't even wet her feet. Grandfather, cautiously, fearfully even asked Angelica, "Do you think I'm afraid of the dark because I'm going crazy?" "No, well, what do you mean?" The old man was indignant. "It's just that you're an impressionable person, but I'm afraid some inclinations in women of our kind still have. Only, Angelica, here, I beg you, do not think that you go crazy. Rather, I repeat, you are extremely impressionable nature, and you in life contraindicated strong emotional shocks. And also, by the way, if you believe what went among the women of our family, you may have the gift of a psychic, a seer. I wouldn't want that." Angelica shrugged shakily, though the room was very warm. "What happened to Mom?" "And with her, dear, what happened is this. And again, I'm sorry that you have to learn all this. Your mom fell in love with a man when she graduated. It was clearly a hopeless case, but she decided that he was a man destined by fate. I was ill with something like asthma at that time, and since I had the opportunity, I decided to move to the countryside to improve my health. At the same time, I began to teach the locals here. That is, there was a school here, everything. But I gave lessons, was, let's say, a tutor in history. I like to collect local folklore. I'd even thought at one time to find treasure, according to legends buried here somewhere. And you can imagine, we found it, a pot with ancient coins. As I remember now, the reward was divided among everyone honestly. Oh, we had a week's walk then. Anyway, we came here. Selena was very sad that she left her beloved. But here's how it turned out. He was married and his wife was pregnant. So Selena decided to do the old-fashioned love spell, and she chose Aleftina as her assistant. We had such an old woman here, a mean one. She persuaded Selena to go to the forest at night, to the swamp, and there to do something dark. In general, when we returned to the city, the man himself began to run after Selena. I was worried about my daughter. Why did he change his mind about his love? And it turned out that he had a misfortune in the family. Wife lost a baby and doctors said that they will not have any more children. So he was probably looking for her replacement. Only the temper they had with Selena were not alike at all, and he began to swear at her often, offended. And then it turned out that he has another friend and here she is pregnant. Apparently, he was still when with his wife everything was fine, had an affair on the side. In general, he left my Selena. Oh, how many tears she shed for him. I thought that here, the next summer when we came here, then rest, fresh air will heal her. But I was wrong. Selena got it into her head that it was because of her sorcery that her wife lost her beloved child. I told her that this nonsense is rare, but she did not listen and kept saying that she would be punished for this. Karma would catch up with her. The time was not easy then, granddaughter. Not the heart of the 90s, of course, but in some places they were still on their feet. Bandits. Anyway, cottages were already being built in Kabankiki. Those who were richer were vacationing. And it so happened that my Selena started to go to the forest. The same Aleftina advised her, of course, not for free. Some rituals to remove the consequences of the spell. And one day Selena ran into bandits in the woods. They were having some kind of showdown. In general, it was a bad business, but it so happened that the leader liked her. He said he'd let her go as anyway, she had to lie down with him so he could pretend she wasn't there, so that he'd quiet his men who were afraid she'd tell someone what she'd seen. Here, she went to this man for several days. More precisely, she ran away in the evenings and came back in the morning. She revealed herself to me when they were already back in town, and it became clear that she was expecting a child. That's how, granddaughter, you appeared. Angelica listened, and it seemed to her that grandfather, of course, about another person, because, well, it could not all relate to her favorite mother, to herself. But the realization that it was true and it was all about her family, still came over her. Robert paused and then, reading from his granddaughter's look that she understood everything, continued. He tried to find that man, but it turned out that the leader had run away. Someone had gotten into a fight, and he had to flee. And Celine told him not to look, not to anger. Angelica was tormented by ambivalent feelings that night. On the one hand, she realized how important it was to understand what was happening to her mother. But on the other hand, now she knew for sure that her life would never be the same again. And it seemed that now there was something in her that confused everything even more, pushing her somewhere forward, into the darkness. The next day, grandfather said that he would be very busy. He had to call his friends in the city, who promised to find a good realtor, and also to send some documents on the apartment to slowly start a big deal to sell it. Not now, of course, but later, when the inheritance will all work out. But we have to start now. And what should I do? Angelica sighed. Oh, dragonfly. Really like a little. Well, think of a case. There you can continue to clean the house, you can cook dinner. Robert curled his fingers, enumerating, but then, seeing the upset face of his granddaughter, decided to give another idea. Better yet, go to the library. It's a good one here. Here, now I'll write you a list of books to look at there. I'm thinking of writing a book on local folklore. So you, look and bring these. Such a case could not be called particularly exciting. But firstly, Angelica, it seemed much more interesting than sitting at home. And secondly, the girl mentally again scolded herself for the fact that even ranted. And so she decided to bring what her grandfather needed. And as soon as he came back, to do, in fact, lunch. The library turned out to be exactly as Angelica had expected, small but very cozy. The smell of books was joined by the scent of fresh wood, recently renovated. When she had finished with the formalities of signing in as a new reader, Angelica wandered among the shelves, stopping occasionally to take down a book, open it, and then put it back. She didn't feel like reading at all, so she decided to just quickly pick up whatever her grandfather had told her to bring. Ouch, said the girl when she pulled one of the books, but it did not yield. Then she pulled harder and the volume slipped off the shelf, and behind it was found a man, so it happened by chance that at the same time they wanted to take the same copy. Hello, said Angelica and smiled, because the other visitor in the empty library at that hour was Alexander. It seems that we have already changed to the first name, he smiled. Yes, sorry, I'm sorry. The girl was completely confused and hastily handed him a book. Take it. I think you were the first to take it. It's okay, he refused. I was just looking for something to read on local legends, and you seem to be collecting a list, he nodded, his eyes pointing at the sheet clutched in Angelica's hand. My grandfather sent me. And what do you need it for? For myself, for the book. Are you a historian too? Angelica was surprised. No, I'm a writer, and I'm working on something. I decided not to waste time while I'm resting here. Maybe. Can you recommend some literature? I'm looking for a werewolf book. That's for Grandpa. Angelica answered immediately. I don't read that kind of stuff. I don't like horror stories. Oh, you're missing a lot. Alexander winked. It is natural in human nature to strive for safe fear, and that's what we experience when we read appropriate literature or watch movies. No, confidently continued to refuse Angelica. I somehow, and in life, she awkwardly coughed. By the way, and maybe, really, on Tito has come over. Maybe, the guy seemed to answer simply, but there was something infinitely stubborn in his voice, as if he was never going to come to visit. But he did come. That same day, he showed up at 7 o'clock in the evening with a bouquet of flowers and a cake. Oh, this is unnecessary, Angelica said embarrassedly, taking the bouquet. "Oh, what do you think?" Alexander jokingly replied, going into the house. "I brought the cake just in case. What if you are a terrible cook?" Winked at the girl. Angelica almost choked with indignation, but then, appreciating the impertinent joke, grinned. "I do serve a birch bark pie to harmful guests, but such pretty blondes can count on something better." Grandpa greeted the guests friendly, but without any jokes. They sat down to drink tea and the conversation began. It turned out that Alexander came to Cabanchique to rest from the bustle of the city and at the same time in such favorable, inspiring conditions to work on some of his literary projects. He was 24 years old. He had recently graduated from the Faculty of Philology and was going to devote his life to literature, not only as a writer, but also as an editor, and the guy planned to work in a publishing house. Alexander generously told about himself, except for his family. He got off with general phrases about the fact that his father and mother are no longer in the world, and naturally, after this, neither Angelica nor Robert did not begin to ask about anything else. And then, somehow so imperceptibly, it turned out that Alexander and Angelica began to see each other more and more often. They were, in fact, meetings of friends. It turned out that Alexander knew only a little less about the local area than Grandpa Robert. Alexander showed Angelica an amazingly beautiful forest lake, and although now it was completely out of season, but from his words she easily and vividly imagined how in early summer it is covered with lily flowers. The guy invited her to go down into a small cave. Even more likely it was a grotto, but Angelica flatly refused and panicked, and he also did not hide the fact that she tries not to go out after sunset. And one day he asked her directly, "Are you afraid of the dark? Why do you say that?" Angelica answered as if indifferently, but her heart froze. Because it seemed to her just nightmarish if the guy she had already begun to like so much and with whom she spent more time than with any man she had ever known before, found out about such a stupid, just shameful fear of her. It was just a thought. Angelica snorted indignantly and hurried to change the subject. But gradually their meetings began to take on a slightly different character than it could be with friends. Alexander began to look for opportunities to touch her more often. Angelica, without understanding why, but avoided it, somehow shrunk into a lump ball. And once when he saw her off and parted already on the porch of her house, Alexander reached for her face. Fingertips outlined her cheekbone and went down to her chin. He said nothing, but came closer. "No," the girl exclaimed and turned away abruptly. Her head was pulled into her shoulders, her palms pressed into the shoulders, pushing away. Angelica did not know that in those moments Alexander managed to read in her eyes fear mixed with disgust, and he realized that these feelings did not apply to him, and he wanted to tear to shreds the one who dared to hurt the one who became indifferent to him. Alexander swore to himself that he would not hesitate to find out who Angelica had met before, and then he would find out who treated her unworthily. But right now he pretended that everything was fine, and simply, as if nothing had happened to say goodbye, left. One day the girl came home from the store and, sorting out her purchases, began to recount to her grandfather the conversation she had with the saleswoman. It was an ordinary, in fact, meaningless chatter, until Angelica mentioned that according to the sales clerk, Alexander really liked to vacation here. Just a few years ago came with his father Billy. "What?" Grandpa asked the question so sharply and in such a tone that Angelica jumped and almost dropped the carton of eggs, which she was going to put in the refrigerator. "Well, I told you that Alexander is here with his father." "Say his last name again," you said, "Billy." "Yes," nodded the girl, not understanding at all what the matter was. "You mustn't see him again," Robert said and sat down on a chair, putting his hand to his chest. He was having trouble breathing. "Oh, that's it, the creature." "Grandfather." Angelica was frightened on several occasions at once, both that her grandfather was ill and that he had reacted in such a way to the mere mention of Father Alexander's name. "Are you sick, doctor?" "No, granddaughter." The old man wrinkled his nose. "Everything is fine. No need for a doctor. I'm not quite decrepit yet. And as for that, young man, you mustn't see him again, do you hear?" "But," Angelique blinked a lot. "Why?" Robert looked at his granddaughter carefully. He shook his head. "Sweetheart, just trust me. It's better this way." "But I..." We have, began Angelica suddenly. We are with him. He called me. On a date. What? Grandpa started to get up, but then he sat back down. That's it. No, it's impossible. But why? Did he do something wrong? Why are you forbidding me like a little girl? I'm an adult and I can do what I want. No, as long as I'm alive, you can't see him. Barry's son can't be a good man. So this is about his father. Angelica finally figured it out. Did you two know each other? Robert got up at last. He came closer and put his trembling hands on Angelica's shoulders. Yes, granddaughter, Billy. That was the name of the man who... That's your father. Billy is the thug who crippled your mom's life. Alexander is his son, which means he's your brother. Angelique felt like the air in the room had run out. It had just been there and then it was gone. Instead of it spilled flames. And it now hit her chest with a heavy wave, making her gasp, look around panic-stricken. The girl waited in panic when she would lose consciousness, fall awkwardly on the floor. Yes, she would fall and hit, but for some reason it was not happening. What was said simply could not be reality, no. That her Alexander, that man who could so easily make her laugh, whose innocent touch awakened a storm of feelings, he turned out to be her brother? That's impossible. It's wrong. It shouldn't have happened like this. The evening and night, in which Angelica barely closed her eyes on the verge of dawn, seemed to her an agonizing eternity. Again and again she asked her grandfather how could it be? Could it be a different Billy? But he answered that no, it was. After all, this man, who was mentioned in the store conversation, many people remembered here until now, he heard the whole neighborhood in fear. Angelica did not know what to think. She suddenly remembered how Alexander had scared those guys in the car away from her. They so backed off. Can it be that appearance and impressions all turned out to be deceptive? That his father raised Alexander to be a copy of himself, and he's just as much of a monster? And also Angelica could not understand. Did Alexander himself know about it? Did Alexander know that his father was a bandit? And although her grandfather ordered and practically begged her not to see him anymore, Angelica decided to do her own thing. And the next day, she went to the place where they agreed to meet outside the village, near the forest edge, where the field began, from which the ride had recently been taken off. Seeing Alexander approaching, the girl got up from the stump where she had been sitting before and clasped her hands. "Hi," said the guy and frowned, noticing her face with such an expression, which mixed fear, disgust, and hope. He had never seen her before. Angelica decided to deal with it quickly. "I was told your father's name was Billy. Is that true?" He was a gangster, wasn't he?" Alexander was taken aback. He hadn't expected this conversation. Or rather, he hadn't expected it to happen so soon and in such an uncomfortable way when he wasn't the one setting the tone. Yes, Billy was doing business, not quite legally. He'd been punished for it, and then went back to business without a mistake. Mistakes. Angelica gasped and took a step back. "So you called the dirt and blood on his hands mistakes?" "Angelica, calm down. I didn't put it that way. I only meant to say that at the end Oh, at the end. I'm more interested in how it all started. Your father," the girl sobbed. My mom." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment and then, opening them, looked, as it seemed to Angelica, into her heart. "I know. Angelica, listen, I have so much to tell you. There's a lot you don't know. And So you do know?" She exhaled. "Do you know that you are my brother?" said the girl in a colorless voice. "You are my brother. You knew that too, man. You asked me out. You almost kissed me then. How could you? How could you?" Angelica felt nauseous. A suffocating, viscous lump of it seemed to flood her entire being. And it was a feeling she knew well. She had experienced it when her stepfather had attacked her. "Grandfather was right," the girl sobbed. "Angelica, I'll explain everything. I don't." The boy started, but Angelica, having shrieked briefly, didn't let him finish and slapped her cheek with the palm of her hand. Angelica had never hit anyone before, and it became so hard. It seemed that inside now breaks off, burns out something infinitely valuable, which will never come back. I hate you. Don't you dare come near me." Choking on her tears, Angelica retreated. Never. Do you hear me? Never. And she ran. The wind blew in her face. The weather began to deteriorate, and from the horizon floated rapidly, carried fluffy monstrous thunderclouds. Alexander did not rush after her. He stayed where he was. He just didn't know. He didn't know how to say that she just didn't know the whole truth, and that they could be together. There's no obstacle to that. She just didn't want to hear about it. He was also distracted by a phone call. It was a call from a man whom Alexander had instructed to solve an important issue, and from the first words, as he answered it, it became clear that everything was much worse than he thought. Already approaching the house, Angelica began to suffer a bad feeling. The girl froze when she saw a white ambulance in the yard, and then rushed forward, as far as breath and strength after running from heartless, disgusting betrayal. "Grandfather? Grandpa!" screamed the girl, rushing toward the stretcher that was being loaded into the car. "What happened?" "Are you his granddaughter, Angelica?" asked the doctor, who caught her carefully. "He called for you." "It's okay. He's alive." "A heart attack. He needs to be hospitalized. You can come with us." The young doctor spoke quickly and clearly, keeping eye contact with the distraught girl. Yes, Angelica nodded. Of course he wanted to come, and so scared for dear beloved grandfather that all other problems, his own broken heart, all receded into the background. In the end, after the grandfather was in the ward of the hospital of the district center under the careful supervision of doctors, Angelica had to go back, with great difficulty, but the doctors managed to persuade her that spending the night in the hospital is not the best idea. Besides, the patient needed to bring some necessary personal belongings from home. And only when she went outside, Angelica realized that she had neither money nor even a cell phone with her. And meanwhile, it was getting darker and darker. "Wow, what people!" A car with guys from the village slowed down near her. "It's cold to look at you," smirked the one who sat in the driver's seat. Angelica was surprised to realize that it was really cold, and she was wearing a light dress, which she had chosen in the morning, when the weather was still wonderful and warm in summer. "Are you waiting for the streetcar?" the guy in the back seat asked snidely, but immediately received a poke in the side from his buddy. "Stop laughing. Can't you see something's wrong with her?" He leaned out the window. "What's wrong?" Angelica did not like to cry in front of strangers, but here she burst into tears and said that her grandfather became ill, and she did not know how to return home. "So get in, we'll give you a ride." The driver waved an inviting hand. "Well, if you're not afraid, like last time. We're honest. We're not evil people." Angelica nodded. She thought that she had made a mistake once before. She thought that Alexander was a good guy. She had fallen for how nice he was, and it turned out. So now she opened the door without fear and climbed into the back seat. The two guys had to squeeze in. On the way, they exchanged a few phrases. The guys introduced themselves as Max, the driver Mickey, the one who had asked about the streetcar, Harvey, and Steve. And then one of them mentioned Alexander in the conversation. Angelica asked that this was a man she didn't want to talk about at all. "Did they have a fight? I thought you two were like that. Dating." Harvey said. "Well, it's common knowledge in the village." "No, it's nothing like that." Angelica burst into flames. "He's not at all what I thought he was. He's a terrible man." "Is that Alexander?" Max marveled sincerely. "Well, you women honestly do not understand. You want bad guys. You don't like who would refuse it." When Barry got out of crime, he became a businessman. He made a lot of money, and then he died, just like his friend in the accident. It's mystical. And then there was a lot of noise that Barry gave everything to this kid in his will. He was a regular guy, but now he's a millionaire. Obviously, everyone was wondering why, so they started talking. Barry lived his whole life alone. He had women, but only for a while. He changed them like foreign cars. I guess he realized later that he hadn't had time to have children. Mickey joined in the story again. They started saying Alexander was Barry's son. Blood. Well, as if he'd had an affair with his friend's wife once, and then, in order not to ruin the family, kept everything secret. So it turned out that somehow everyone here decided that Alexander was the heir of that bandit, and that was it. Well, at first, we also thought that hair came, We would all go under bandits again. But then we talked to him and it became clear that Alexander is not engaged in any such business. He is as pure as snow. And what they say, well, what difference does it make? Whether he's Barry's son or not? Barry's like a second father to him. He helped him get back on his feet. Oh, we've had a good talk, Steve said, nodding toward the road where the village loomed ahead. Well, we got you there. Well, you. Angelica got out of the car as if in a trance, and her head did not fit all that she heard now. In general, we told you everything as it is, summarized Max. Bye. And the car drove off. Angelica walked through the yard to the house. The meager, milky white moonlight was chasing dry autumn leaves. Some twigs crunched under her feet, and the girl distantly thought about the fact that the garden was in such disrepair. It would be necessary to put everything in order. Angelica did not allow herself to think that something terrible could happen to her grandfather. Grandpa Robert is a tough guy. He'll be fine. He'll live to be 100. Forcing herself to smile, Angelica walked up the porch and stopped in front of the door. I think she locked it when she left in a hurry in the ambulance. If such a return to the house with unlocked doors had happened to her before, she would have been terrified. But the past events had thrown her into a strange state of mind, and she acted as if she were acting machine-like, without thinking. And only when the door closed and the hallway was plunged into darkness, Angelica woke up, shrieked quietly, and tapped her hand on the wall in search of a switch. Where is it? Where? I found it. Something rustled, and Angelica did not immediately realize that it was the wind howling outside the windows. And until the light flashed brightly in the hallway, Angelica stood there and her gaze hysterically darted around the corners, the floor. Fear, that almost childish hidden, spread its paws, crawled out inexorably, but it was chased away by the light. The girl even began to laugh right about her grandfather's set. Well, what nonsense. There's nothing like that in the dark. Angelica in general lately began to think that she was not afraid of anything. She was less afraid of the dark. And the memories of her stepfather and his ugly hands faded. Everything was getting better until she learned the truth about Alexander. Angelica shook her head. What on earth was that supposed to mean? He might not be her brother. But what does that change? Does it change everything? Or should she not be foolishly naive? Because how could a man like Barry have good friends? Could a normal young man who agreed to live and build his life, in fact, under the patronage of this monster? Angelica shook her head though. She was thinking about the wrong thing. After all, right now she had other things to do. To collect the things that her grandfather would need at the hospital. Also to inform his friends what happened. Plus, of course, to prepare a home-cooked meal. These were all things Angelica decided to do early in the morning. The girl smiled, imagining how she would surprise her grandfather with his favorite zucchini pancakes. Only it is necessary not to fry them, and it is better to bake them in the oven. She went to her room and set her alarm clock for 7 in the morning. Then she took a shower and changed into her favorite warm pajamas. The girl reached for the bedside table to turn on the night light. She had already resigned herself to the fact that she would probably sleep with at least some light on for the rest of her life. But her hand found only a void. Angelica frowned and dropped it on the floor. She looked around, behind the nightstand and under the bed. The nightlight was nowhere to be found, but she definitely remembered it being here. Grandpa would never move her things without asking, and why would he? Suddenly the light in the room went out. Angelica gasped and hurriedly grabbed the phone. Hurry! The bright light of the tiny flashlight built into it cut through the darkness. She stepped out into the hallway. There didn't seem to be any light anywhere. None of the switches had tripped. Angelica sighed. This was such a thunderstorm. She felt uncomfortable. Would she really have to spend the night like this, leaving her phone on until morning? She glanced at the battery image and just clutched her head, ran her fingers through her hair and squeezed it nervously. There was only one division left in green. The phone was practically dead, and since there was no electricity, that meant it was about to go out. But before panic set in, she remembered that in the kitchen, in the sick closet, the most ordinary candles and matches should be kept, which meant everything would be fine. She would be left in total darkness. It was only a short walk to the kitchen, and in order not to be so frightened, because the darkness was too much around, Angelica quietly began to hum a song. "A beautiful voice, my little one." The girl stopped as if she had hit a wall. Her body stiffened. No, not with fear. It was a different feeling. Hard, all-encompassing, paralyzing. She breathed often. "Did you miss your daddy?" Angelica glanced away, then found the strength to turn around. Her stepfather stood about 4 feet away from her on the threshold of the next room, the living room, lit sparingly by the moon, which had finally emerged as a gray disk through the gaps in the rain clouds. "What? How?" The words stuck in my throat, my tongue refusing to utter them. "Did you think your old man would save you?" My stepfather smirked, or rather grinned. Not hiding the pleasure, but not delaying it, he told his stepdaughter how it was. How he came to his senses in the morning, beaten, humiliated. For a few days it was all the same, where the little trash and the old man disappeared. But then different thoughts began to come, and then a man contacted him, called the lawyer who represents Robert's interests. He said that Robert intends to sell the apartment. "And I thought," continued the stepfather, "what does that mean? Me, the breadwinner of the family, on the street. All Angelica grew up, big became, and that's it. Do not need a man in the house. Thinks she will live on her own. She's so big." "Well, what are your eyes bulging?" Stepfather stepped forward. You, grandfather," began Angelica, but he interrupted. "You're a fool, Angelica." "No, it was different. I've been here a long time. I've been looking after you. Well, it's a nice house. Expensive, I suppose. And you were so poor. Well, we'll fix everything," he muttered quietly, thinking something over, and smiled at her again in a nasty way. He looked at her from top to bottom, as if he were groping her. "You're hiding in your pajamas like a sack. You should put on a nightgown, or even better, stockings." Angelica shook. She shook her head. "No," she whispered, feeling tears forming in her eyes. "I was just thinking," the stepfather continued, and took another step. "How fortunate it all turned out. The old man's gone. You and I, sweetie, alone. It's a long night. We'll have time to talk, and you'll have time then to sign over your share of the apartment to me." It was only here that Angelique realized her mistake. She should have run to the street and then to the village. Of course, there, on the road, there would be nowhere to hide. But what prevents his stepfather now go looking for him? And the girl also thought that now it was time to call for help, but the phone suddenly went out of battery. Whimpering, Angelica shook it as if that would revive the battery. In this room, there was also a little light coming through the window. Angelica could see the table, a large armchair with a carved back. This was where Grandpa wanted to make an office, and suddenly her eyes caught on the bag, her grandfather's second travel bag, which had disturbed her on the train. It took Angelica only a few moments to remember what was stored there and how it could help her. Meanwhile, behind the door, somewhere in the corridor, John's drunken shouts and the sounds of doors opening were heard. He was checking the rooms, looking for her. And there was no doubt that sooner or later, and most likely not too late, he would reach this one. Could there be another way out? Angelica ran to the window, opened it, but second floor. She was just afraid to jump down. There weren't even any bushes that could theoretically cushion the fall, only the stonework in this part of the courtyard. Angelica cried again. Freedom is so close and she can't get it. Meanwhile, judging by the sounds, her stepfather had busied himself with checking the room across the hall. Trying not to make any noise now, Angelica grabbed the bag. She opened it, opened the box. Naturally, it was impossible to handle such a tool as this trapped silently. The girl had time to curse herself. Well, where would she get the strength and in general, how to handle this thing? The trap had no teeth, and so Angelica could act more boldly, sharper, without fear of injury. Finally, it opened with a rattle. How she did it and did not realize it herself, just worked with her hands, turning off her head. In the next moment, the trap was on the floor near the door, and Angelica herself snuck away, lurking behind the closet, just in time. The door slowly opened. "Where are you, little girl? You know, I don't like hiding. Come out yourself, or it'll be worse." The last word turned into a shrill cry of pain as John's foot caught in the trap. He just didn't see it, because when he entered the room, he was shining the flashlight in front of him, not down below. Angelica lunged straight at her stepfather. Dodge. but felt his fingers trying to grab her leg. Shit. John sent a couple more curses after her. The first wave of pain was gone, and his body had little sense of reality after the drink. The man realized that his leg didn't seem to be broken. John dug his hands into the brackets and pulled them apart. How did the damn thing open? How did it get in here in the first place? And how did Angelica, the weak, fearful Angelica, know how to do it? How dare she? After vividly imagining what he'd do to her when he got there, John finally managed to free the limb. He groaned through clenched teeth as he stood up and decided he would never let the girl live for this. Angelica ran through the dark house, and for the first time this darkness did not frighten her. Now all the horror, all the fears, all the nightmare that could only exist for her in the universe embodied in her stepfather. The girl was descending the stairs, had already put her foot down on the last bottom step, when suddenly the foot in the slipper awkwardly led sideways. Shrieking, Angelica fell down, bumping her elbow painfully. Gasping for breath, she got up and ran into something. Strong arms embraced her, lifting her above the floor. The girl screamed, struggling to break free. Angelica, it's okay. Angelica, it's me. The familiar voice had a better effect in an instant than if the light had suddenly turned on. The light, by the way, was coming from the street through the open door, and it was coming from the flashlight dropped on the floor by the one who was holding her. Angelica stared at Alexander's face, opening her mouth helplessly. For some reason she couldn't speak. Finally, she squeezed out hoarsely. Your stepfather. Alexander nodded, then bent down, picked up the flashlight, and holding Angelica under his arm, led her to the door. Come on, I've already called for help. But she couldn't take a step. Her ankle was pierced by pain. Alexander picked her up in his arms and carried her out of the house. His car was just outside the yard gate. What? How did you? Angelica clung to him, clung desperately as he set her on the ground and then, opening the door to the front passenger seat, helped her into the car. I'll tell you later, he replied sternly. Stay here. Where are you going? No, Angelica was horrified when she realized that Alexander was walking back to the house. It's all right, he turned to her. But he mustn't go. He can't get away with this. A trap, Angelica said hurriedly, wrapping her arms around her shoulders. I said a trap. What? The boy asked in surprise. Where did you? Are there traps in the house? One. Grandfather's. I put it in the room he came in and he got caught with his foot. What have I done? Alexander came back, leaned toward her. His palms rested on the girl's face, forcing her to raise her head and look into his eyes. Don't worry. Everything will be all right. Just be here. Much later, returning in memories to the events of that night and the next day, Angelica wondered how all of them, starting from the moment when Alexander took her out of the house in his arms, were put together in one brief segment, as if cutting fragments from a movie in which she, by the will of an evil fate, was destined to play the main role. The stepfather was too drunk and clumsy. He ran into Alexander at the top of the stairs, but he almost fell down and the guy easily managed to pull him to the floor and tie the villain's hands with his own belt from his pants. And then came the help. It turned out that Robert's grandfather in the village was a lot of old acquaintances. Someone visited him in the hospital, and of course, because of the visitors was nothing to think about, even a little time to keep what happened in secret. Angelica only tried to soften the whole picture, to disturb her grandfather less. But to her amazement, he only said that she was a good girl, and on the part in which the trap was involved, and laughed at all, and so that the nurse looked in to find out what happened. Nothing, he said, wiping the tears from his eyes. Here, I had a memorabilia with a history, a trap antique. They said they used to catch werewolves with it. Well, such a legend, but here's how it turned out. Also, a kind of werewolf, my granddaughter caught a creature that pretended to be a man, and our family soul entered. Oh, what a story. It turns out I've kept this junk all these years for a reason. John was furious that his plan had failed. He did not hesitate in expressions in everyone he saw, talking about how he hates stepdaughter, what a bad girl she is. Finally, it became clear that he had a problem with his head. John would suddenly start sobbing and say that it was him. He was the victim. because while he was sitting there in the darkness of the house, while he was walking through it wounded, he had suffered all sorts of things. He swore on his life that Alexander, who had grabbed him, had eyes that burned with fire and claws on his hands, that he smelled of wet dog and had fangs in his mouth that glistened in the moonlight. He was also afraid now, hysterical if he was in the dark. John had been declared insane. "You won't see him again," Alexander said, and hugged Angelica, gently and tenderly, so tightly that it was easy to feel the desire to shelter his beloved from the world. He told her that some time ago he had become aware that his stepfather was looking for Angelica. Alexander learned that John had come to the village, and while the stepfather was watching the girl, he himself was being watched. Alexander wanted to wait a moment and have a serious talk with this man, threaten him, but here it turned out he missed it. At some point, he got word that John had gone somewhere. At first, he thought that John had left the village, but when he realized where he had gone, he barely managed to save Angelica. And almost immediately, the day after the rescue, Alexander clarified the most important thing. He said he was not related to Barry by blood. He'd had doubts about that, even when the family friend had called them over. He told Billy himself honestly about it, admitted that the rumors had raised doubts. And to dispel them, he suggested a paternity test. And it turned out that the rumors were just rumors. And Alexander also told that in confidential conversations, his patron expressed regrets that much in his life has done wrong, a lot of evil. Robert, after Alexander saved Angelica, changed his opinion of him and added that during his illness, he had plenty of time to think about everything. "I was wrong," Robert said firmly. "Just because Barry was his family doesn't say that Alexander himself is bad. After all, John was in our family. There are different things after all." Alexander objected suddenly. "I took him in willingly, and you and your granddaughter were forced to live like this. But I'm grateful that you're giving me a chance." "I just see how you have changed Angelica," Robert grinned. "She has blossomed with you. Anyway, since there is no other elder relative, I personally give the go-ahead for your marriage." "Grandfather," Angelica exclaimed. "We do not." "You beat me to it," Alexander smiled. "I was going to propose to Angelica, but apparently now there will be no surprise. But the essence won't change, will it?" With these words, Alexander knelt down on the floor and took out a scarlet velvet box from his pocket and opened it in front of Angelica. "I am not good at long, beautiful speeches, probably because I'm more used to writing books. I just want to say that I love you. I guess that's what they call love at first sight. I want us to be together forever, and I'm willing to do anything for that." Angelica listened, and it seemed to her that all this was not happening to her. And at the same time, they did not doubt the truthfulness of Alexander's words. "I agree," the girl answered quietly, and the next moment on her finger was a ring with a large, transparent and shining, like a dewdrop, diamond. In addition to Robert's grandfather, there were other patients in the room, and they, who had been quiet, but had been watching with great interest, suddenly began to say congratulations, and some of them even clapped their hands. A nurse, now displeased with the double, looked in again, but when she heard the cause of the commotion, she could not remain indifferent to it. After Robert recovered, of course, they talked about the future. If earlier grandfather was going to sell the apartment in order to make his granddaughter a single room and to buy a room for his old age, probably with the same lonely old people, now there was no need for this. Alexander was sufficiently provided for Robert to keep his home. But that was not all. Angelica's future husband insisted that the house in Kabankiki should be put in the best possible condition, providing it with the best modern renovations, but necessarily one in which the house could retain its unique original style. Grandfather was right. Alexander's society continued to influence Angelique in the best possible way. And by the time they were married, she had rid herself of the heavy burden of past memories. The night after the wedding, when it was time for bed, Alexander smiled at his young wife and asked if she should leave the light on for the night. "No," replied Angelica with a smile. "Now I am no longer afraid of the dark, because I have you." Soon after the wedding, the girl realized her dream of entering the same faculty that her grandfather had once studied. Robert said that of course he would definitely help her with her studies. And Alexander published his book, a collection of legends about werewolves. And although his wife still didn't like the scary books, and movies her husband sometimes entertained herself with. She read his book and said it was terribly interesting.